Promortalism. What if I told you that death is actually a gift, and the greatest moral action would be to end all life on Earth? This isn't science fiction, it's promortalism, and some philosophers believe it's the most ethical position possible. Before we dive deeper into these controversial philosophies, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover that all conscious life on Earth had painlessly ceased to exist overnight. Every human, every animal, anything capable of suffering, simply stopped being. No pain, no awareness, just the peaceful void of non-existence. Would this be the greatest catastrophe in history, or the greatest act of compassion ever performed? According to promortalism, it would be the latter. In fact, it would be the single most ethical event possible. Promortalism stands as philosophy's ultimate taboo, a position so fundamentally opposed to our biological programming that merely considering it feels like a transgression. Yet its logic follows a ruthless path that's difficult to refute. The argument begins with a simple observation. Life inevitably contains suffering. Even the most privileged human existence includes physical pain, emotional distress, disappointment, illness, and eventually death. For most sentient beings, suffering significantly outweighs pleasure across a lifetime. As philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer grimly observed in the 19th century, if the immediate and direct purpose of our life is not suffering, then our existence is the most ill-adapted to its purpose in the world. But promortalism goes beyond Schopenhauer's pessimism. It builds on the work of contemporary philosophers like David Benatar, whose asymmetry argument forms the cornerstone of antinatalism, the view that bringing new life into existence is morally wrong. Benatar's argument is elegantly simple. The presence of pain is bad. The presence of pleasure is good. The absence of pain is good, even if there is no one to experience this absence. The absence of pleasure is only bad if there is someone being deprived of it. This asymmetry leads to a startling conclusion. Non-existence is always better than existence, because non-existence contains no pain, which is good, and the absence of pleasure isn't bad because there's no one being deprived. Promortalism takes this reasoning to its logical endpoint. If coming into existence is always a harm, and non-existence is always better than existence, then death, the return to non-existence, must be a good thing. Not just a necessary evil or a neutral state, but an actual benefit. This perspective inverts our entire moral framework. Suddenly, extending life becomes questionable, and ending suffering through non-existence becomes the highest good. Consider the scale of suffering in our world. At this very moment, millions of humans are experiencing intense physical or emotional pain. Billions of animals are suffering in factory farms, research laboratories, or the brutal indifference of nature where they're being torn apart by predators or dying slowly from disease or starvation. All of this suffering could be permanently eliminated through non-existence. No future generations would suffer either. The cycle of pain would be permanently broken. The philosopher Thomas Ligotti puts it starkly in his work, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. Without consciousness, there would be no horror, no pain, no suffering. Of course, most people instinctively recoil from promortalism. We're programmed by evolution to fear death and cling to life. But this programming evolved to perpetuate our genes, not to maximize well-being or minimize suffering. Promortalists argue that our fear of death is simply an evolutionary adaptation, like our preference for sugar or fat, that served survival but doesn't necessarily serve welfare. Just because we fear death doesn't make it bad, any more than our craving for sugar makes it healthy. The Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zapffe suggested that human consciousness itself is an evolutionary mistake. We evolved minds capable of recognizing the fundamental tragedy of existence, then had to develop psychological mechanisms to repress this knowledge just to function. According to Zapffe, humans employ 4 main mechanisms to cope with the unbearable awareness of our condition. Isolation, pushing disturbing thoughts away. Anchoring, creating artificial meaning through culture and traditions. Distraction, keeping ourselves constantly occupied. Sublimation, transforming existential angst into art or philosophy. These mechanisms allow us to function, but they're essentially elaborate self-deceptions. Promortalism suggests dropping the pretense altogether. The most common objection to promortalism is the consent problem. People generally don't want to die, so ending life would violate their autonomy. But promortalists counter that this desire to live is itself based on delusion, a combination of evolutionary programming and psychological defense mechanisms. Is consent meaningful if it's based on false consciousness? We don't typically consider a cult member's consent to exploitation valid when it's based on indoctrination. Why should we privilege life-affirming attitudes when they might simply reflect biological indoctrination? Another objection involves the potential for future happiness. Even if suffering currently outweighs happiness, couldn't technology eventually create a utopia where this equation is reversed? Promortalists are skeptical. The history of technological advancement shows that each solution creates new problems. Nuclear power brought the threat of nuclear war. The internet brought unprecedented connectivity, but also new forms of alienation and exploitation. Even if we could eliminate physical suffering, psychological suffering might simply evolve to fill the void. As David Pearce, a transhumanist philosopher, acknowledges, in a world of abundance, we would compete for status, attention, and positional goods. Hedonic adaptation ensures that even paradise becomes mundane. Perhaps the most compelling objection to promortalism comes from meaning. Many argue that suffering is the price we pay for meaning, that the struggle against adversity gives life its value. But promortalists question whether meaning itself isn't just another psychological defense mechanism. As Zapffe puts it, man is a tragic animal, not because of his smallness, but because he is too well equipped. Man has longing, man has hope, man can take hold of the future with imagination or with fear, yet man must die. Is meaning real if it's just a story we tell ourselves to make suffering bearable? If it's merely a psychological adaptation to an unbearable truth? The philosopher Émile Cioran, who flirted with promortalist ideas throughout his work, wrote, "It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late." This captures the promortalist's ultimate paradox. By the time you exist to consider promortalism, the primary harm, coming into existence, has already occurred. Death can only prevent future suffering, not undo the suffering already experienced. Real-world manifestations of promortalist thinking remain rare and often misunderstood. The voluntary human extinction movement advocates for humans to stop reproducing, but doesn't advocate death. Various religious traditions that view life as suffering and non-existence as release, certain Buddhist and Hindu concepts, for example, stop short of promortalism's embrace of death as an active good. Perhaps the closest historical example would be the pessimistic strain in German philosophy exemplified by Mainlander, who viewed the universe itself as God's suicide, a divine being's attempt to achieve non-existence. Mainlander himself committed suicide shortly after completing his main philosophical work. The ethical implications of promortalism are staggering. If non-existence is better than existence, what moral obligations do we have? Many philosophers have argued that bringing new life into the world is a moral good, but promortalists view procreation as inflicting harm. Medical professionals work tirelessly to extend life, but promortalists question whether this actually serves welfare. If you follow promortalist logic to its conclusion, the most ethical action possible would be the painless elimination of all sentient life, an omnicidal act that would permanently end all suffering. This makes promortalism not just controversial, but genuinely dangerous if misinterpreted or taken to extremes. Yet the philosophy itself doesn't advocate violence. It actually seeks to minimize suffering. The ideal promortalist scenario would involve all conscious beings simultaneously, painlessly, and voluntarily ceasing to exist. Critics point out an apparent contradiction. If consciousness is the problem, who would be better off without consciousness? Without a subject to experience the absence of suffering, can non-existence really be better than existence? Promortalists respond that this misframes the issue. It's not that the non-existent are better off. It's that by preventing new consciousness from arising, we prevent new suffering from existing. And for those already alive, death ends the capacity for suffering. For most people, the most powerful argument against promortalism isn't philosophical, but visceral. The simple, stubborn fact that we want to live. Despite suffering, despite the apparent meaninglessness of existence, something in us clings to life and recoils from death. Yet this visceral rejection doesn't invalidate promortalism's challenge. It simply demonstrates how deeply our life-affirming biases run. From a promortalist perspective, this is precisely the problem. We're trapped in a kind of Stockholm syndrome with existence, defending and perpetuating the very thing that harms us. Moral nihilism. Every moral rule you've ever followed, every sense of right and wrong you've ever felt, is nothing but a complete fiction, a useful lie we tell ourselves. According to moral nihilism, Hitler and Gandhi are morally equivalent. Disturbing? Perhaps. But what if it's true? Imagine a world where the most heinous crime and the most selfless act of heroism hold exactly the same moral value. 0. No, this isn't some dystopian fiction. This is the logical conclusion of moral nihilism, perhaps the most unsettling philosophical position ever conceived. And the most disturbing part? It might be correct. The year is 1882. Friedrich Nietzsche sits at his desk in Sils Maria, Switzerland. His health is deteriorating, his vision failing. He's working on a manuscript that will later become The Gay Science. With trembling hands, he writes what will become one of the most infamous philosophical declarations in history. God is dead. What Nietzsche meant wasn't merely a statement about religion. He was announcing the collapse of the entire Western moral framework. Without a divine lawgiver, what grounds could there be for objective morality? None, Nietzsche concluded. We had killed God, and with him, objective moral truth. When one gives up the Christian faith, Nietzsche wrote, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Fast forward to 1977. British philosopher J.L. Mackie publishes Ethics Inventing Right and Wrong, in which he presents what he calls moral error theory. Mackie's argument is brutally simple. Our moral language presupposes the existence of objective moral facts, but such facts do not and cannot exist. Therefore, all our moral judgments are false. Mackie wasn't some fringe lunatic. He was a respected philosopher at Oxford University, and his position wasn't based on some peculiar metaphysical assumption. It was based on basic observations about the nature of the world and the peculiar qualities moral facts would need to possess. Consider what a moral fact would have to be. It would need to be somehow built into the fabric of reality. It would need to give people reasons to act regardless of their desires. It would need to be simultaneously factual and motivating. Nothing else in our understanding of the natural world works like this. We don't discover through science that certain actions have the property of wrongness attached to them. We don't detect goodness with instruments or observe it under microscopes. The most common objection to moral nihilism is the appeal to intuition. But we just know that torturing children is wrong. This intuition is powerful, universal, and potentially meaningless. Humans have strong intuitions about many things that turn out to be false. We intuitively believe the sun revolves around the earth. We intuitively believe solid objects are mostly solid, rather than mostly empty space. We intuitively believe in free will despite compelling evidence from neuroscience and physics that challenges this notion. Our moral intuitions may be just as unreliable, not insights into moral reality, but rather evolutionary adaptations that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. Consider a terrifying thought experiment. Imagine a species evolved on another planet. Due to their different evolutionary history, they evolved to feel that causing pain to their offspring increases reproductive fitness. They feel the same powerful moral intuition about this that we feel about protecting our children. Are they objectively wrong? Or do they simply have different evolved intuitions? Or consider psychopaths, who lack the moral intuitions most humans share. Are they privy to the truth that morality is a fiction? Or are they simply missing a crucial form of perception? The moral nihilist offers an elegant explanation. Our moral intuitions don't track objective moral facts because there are no such facts to track. Rather, our moral intuitions evolved because they promoted behaviors that enhanced survival and reproduction in our ancestral environment. The implications are vertiginous. If moral nihilism is true, then Hitler and Gandhi are morally equivalent, not because their actions had equivalent consequences, but because the concept of moral worth itself doesn't correspond to anything real. Moral progress is an illusion. When we abolished slavery or expanded human rights, we didn't discover moral truths or get closer to moral reality. We simply changed our attitudes and social norms. Moral disagreements aren't about facts at all. They're more like disagreements about ice cream flavors than disagreements about mathematical equations. Statements like murder is wrong aren't true or false in the way water is H2O is true. They're expressions of attitude, similar to boo murder or murder yuck. In 2002, philosopher Joshua Green conducted a revolutionary study. He put people in fMRI machines and presented them with moral dilemmas while observing their brain activity. What he found was revelatory. When people make moral judgments, they don't activate the brain regions associated with factual reasoning, but rather those associated with emotion. The science of moral psychology increasingly supports what moral nihilists have long claimed. Our moral judgments are emotional reactions, not perceptions of moral facts. But if morality is just a useful fiction, why do we need it? Why not discard it? Imagine a world without the fiction of morality. Would people still cooperate? Would they still feel empathy? Would they still punish those who harm others? Almost certainly yes. We're deeply social animals with evolved tendencies toward empathy, cooperation, and punishment of norm violations. These don't disappear when we recognize morality as a fiction. Just as knowing that a horror movie isn't real doesn't prevent us from feeling fear while watching it, knowing that morality isn't objectively real doesn't prevent us from feeling moral emotions. In fact, some philosophers argue that recognizing morality as a fiction could be liberating. Instead of searching for non-existent moral facts, we could focus on creating moral systems that better serve human flourishing. This was Nietzsche's vision, a revaluation of all values, where humans would create new values rather than discovering pre-existing ones. He called the person who could create values without appealing to fictional objective standards the Übermensch or Overman. But there's a darker possibility. What if the fiction of morality is a necessary one? What if human civilization depends on most people believing in objective moral truth? This is the fear that haunts moral nihilism. Not that it's false, but that it's true. And that this truth, if widely recognized, would unravel the social fabric. The 20th century offered a glimpse of what might happen when traditional moral frameworks collapse. The totalitarian regimes of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia rose in the aftermath of moral and religious upheaval. Both explicitly rejected traditional morality and replaced it with ideological substitutes. Dostoevsky presciently explored this in The Brothers Karamazov, published in 1880. Ivan Karamazov famously declares, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." The novel then explores the consequences of this view through the character of Smerdyakov, who commits murder based on Ivan's philosophy. But is this fear justified? Would widespread moral nihilism lead to social collapse? The evidence is mixed. Countries with high percentages of atheists and moral non-realists, like Sweden, Denmark, and Japan, don't show higher crime rates or social dysfunction. In fact, they often show lower rates of violent crime, teen pregnancy, and other social ills compared to countries with strong religious and moral realist beliefs. It seems that humans can maintain pro-social behavior even without believing in objective morality. Our evolved empathy, our concern for reputation, our need for cooperation, and our internalized norms may be sufficient to maintain social order. The debate between moral realists, who believe in objective moral facts, and moral nihilist continues in philosophy departments, largely invisible to the wider public. Most people, even highly educated ones, rarely question the assumption that some actions are objectively wrong. But moral nihilism raises questions that cannot be easily dismissed. If moral judgments are factual claims, what kind of facts are they? How do we access these facts? Why do moral facts seem different from other kinds of facts? How do we explain persistent moral disagreement if moral facts exist? For those willing to follow these questions to their logical conclusion, moral nihilism presents a perspective as disturbing as it is difficult to refute. That the moral dimension we experience as an objective feature of reality is, in fact, a projection of our minds, a useful fiction that helped our ancestors survive and cooperate, but a fiction nonetheless. In the end, moral nihilism confronts us with a profound choice. Do we continue to embrace the fiction of morality, knowing it's a fiction? Do we create new values based on shared human concerns rather than fictional moral facts? Or do we stare unflinchingly into the moral abyss, recognizing that in a universe of particles and forces, nothing is inherently right or wrong? In a universe indifferent to human concerns, the only meaning is the meaning we create. The only values are the values we construct. The only purpose is the purpose we design. Nietzsche, that prophet of moral nihilism, put it this way: "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." Even in a world without objective moral truth, we can still have our why. We just need to recognize that we created it ourselves. Metaphysical Solipsism. Look around you right now. Your family, friends, this very video. None of it actually exists outside your mind. According to Metaphysical Solipsism, you're the only conscious being in existence, and everything else is just a projection of your own consciousness. Imagine for a moment that you are the only mind that exists in the universe. Everything you perceive, the device you're watching this on, the room around you, the entirety of human history, every person you've ever loved or hated, all of it exists only as a projection within your consciousness. This isn't the plot of a science fiction movie. This is metaphysical solipsism, arguably the most radical philosophical position ever conceived, and one that's virtually impossible to disprove. Solipsism comes from the Latin solus, alone, and ipse, self, and it makes a single devastating claim: only your mind can be proven to exist with absolute certainty. Everything else is, at best, an unverifiable assumption. The roots of solipsism trace back to René Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes recognized that the only thing he couldn't doubt was his own thinking. Everything else, the external world, other minds, even his own body, could theoretically be an illusion. But while Descartes used this as a starting point to rebuild knowledge, eventually concluding that God wouldn't deceive him about external reality, solipsists take a more radical approach. They stop at that first certainty and ask, what if there is nothing beyond my consciousness? The solipsist's argument is deceptively simple. Everything you experience comes to you through your consciousness. You have never, not once in your life, experienced anything directly outside your consciousness. Therefore, you cannot prove anything exists beyond your consciousness. Consider your current experience. You believe you're watching a video about philosophy, but what you're actually experiencing are visual sensations, auditory sensations, thoughts, and feelings, all of which exist within your consciousness. You've never stepped outside your mind to verify that these sensations correspond to an external reality. You can't. By definition, your experience is limited to your consciousness. This creates what philosophers call the problem of other minds. You assume other people have conscious experiences like yours, but you have no direct access to anyone else's consciousness. You observe bodies that behave as if they have minds, but you never observe the minds themselves. As Ludwig Wittgenstein put it, if I were to look at an object and say, I see a such and such, I would be giving expression to my experience. But if another person were to say, he sees a such and such, he would be offering a hypothesis about my experience. The solipsist takes this problem to its logical conclusion. Since you can never verify the existence of other minds, the simplest explanation is that they don't exist. Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest adequate explanation is preferred, might actually favor solipsism over the belief in billions of unobservable minds. This isn't just abstract philosophical wordplay. The implications are existentially shattering. If solipsism is true, you have never actually connected with another person. You've never been truly loved. You've never been truly understood. The profound experiences of human connection that give life meaning might be elaborate fictions generated by your own mind. Every act of altruism ever performed would be meaningless, since there are no others to benefit. Every moral principle would be baseless, since there are no others to consider. History, science, art, all would be stories your mind tells itself with no external significance. You would be, in the most profound sense possible, alone in the universe. The most common objection to solipsism involves the apparent order and consistency of experience. Why would your mind create such a complex, consistent world with seemingly independent entities that surprise and frustrate you? The solipsist has several responses. First, dreams can be remarkably consistent and vivid while we're in them. Your dreaming mind can create entire worlds with their own physics, populated by apparently conscious beings. Yet no one claims these dream characters have independent existence. Second, the consistency objection assumes your mind is like your everyday ego, limited, with clear preferences. But the solipsistic mind might be more like the unconscious, vast, containing multitudes, capable of generating complexity beyond your conscious control. As for why your mind would create frustrations and limitations for itself, consider how we deliberately seek challenges in games, movies, and fiction. Perhaps the solipsistic mind creates limitations to give itself the experience of growth, surprise, and triumph over adversity. Irish philosopher George Berkeley offered a modified form of solipsism in the 18th century. He agreed that only minds and their perceptions exist, but he avoided solipsism by claiming God perceives everything continuously, ensuring the world persists when humans aren't perceiving it. His famous formula, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived, captures the idealist view that objects exist only as perceptions. The solipsist simply removes Berkeley's God from the equation, leaving only the individual perceiving mind. Modern science might seem to disprove solipsism. After all, doesn't science reveal a universe that existed long before human consciousness and will continue long after? But this objection misunderstands the solipsist position. Science itself is an activity that occurs within consciousness. Scientific discoveries about the age of the universe or its future are still experiences in your mind now. The solipsist doesn't deny these experiences. They simply deny these experiences refer to anything outside consciousness. Consider, if you were a brain in a vat connected to a supercomputer that perfectly simulated reality, your scientific discoveries would simply be part of the simulation. The solipsist goes further. There isn't even a brain or a vat or a computer. There's only consciousness experiencing itself. Perhaps the most powerful objection to solipsism is pragmatic. No one actually lives as if solipsism were true. Even committed philosophical solipsists look both ways before crossing the street, form relationships, and write books trying to convince others of solipsism, which would be pointless if others don't exist. Bertrand Russell dismissed solipsism with characteristic wit. As against solipsism, it is to be said in the first place that it is psychologically impossible to believe and is rejected in fact even by those who mean to accept it. I once received a letter from an eminent logician, Mrs. Christine Ladd Franklin, saying that she was a solipsist and was surprised that there were no others. Coming from a logician, this surprise surprised me. This gap between theoretical acceptance and practical living constitutes what philosophers call the practice problem of solipsism. If everything is a projection of your mind, why does your mind create the persistent illusion of an external reality with other conscious beings? And if it does, shouldn't you engage with that illusion on its own terms? Ludwig Wittgenstein suggested that solipsism, consistently applied, collapses into realism. If everything is in your mind, then the distinction between mind and not mind loses meaning. The universe of your experience simply is, whether you call it mental or physical. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of solipsism is its unfalsifiability. Any evidence you could present against solipsism would itself be an experience in your consciousness, which is exactly what solipsism predicts. The unfalsifiability isn't a weakness of the theory, it's a direct consequence of its core claim. This makes solipsism the philosophical equivalent of a perfect conspiracy theory. It cannot be disproven even in principle, because any attempt to disprove it occurs within the very system it describes. The existential vertigo of solipsism has fascinated philosophers, artists, and spiritual seekers throughout history. The film The Matrix explored a variant of solipsism where reality is a computer simulation. René Magritte's paintings play with the relationship between perception and reality. Certain interpretations of Buddhism suggest that the sense of separate self is an illusion, pointing toward a kind of cosmic solipsism, where there is only one consciousness experiencing itself from countless perspectives. Modern philosophy has largely moved away from metaphysical solipsism, focusing instead on language, social practices, and the structures of shared experience. But the core problem that solipsism identifies, the absolute privacy of consciousness, remains unsolved. Philosopher Thomas Nagel captured this in his famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? We can study bat neurology and behavior in exhaustive detail, but we can never know what it's like to experience the world through echolocation. Consciousness remains stubbornly first-personal and private. This epistemic gap between minds forms the foundation of solipsism. If I can never access your consciousness directly, and you can never access mine, what grounds do we have for believing in each other's existence beyond pragmatic convenience? The ethical implications of solipsism are particularly troubling. If others don't truly exist as independent conscious beings, harm to them isn't harm in the traditional sense. It's more like disliking a character development in a novel you're reading or writing. Most solipsists don't advocate for amorality or harmful behavior. After all, even if others are projections of your mind, causing apparent suffering still creates unpleasant experiences within your consciousness. The world's most mysterious sound. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is hearing it. A low, persistent drone that no one else can detect. It might be in Bristol, England, where hundreds report a constant humming sound that drives them to the edge of sanity. Or in Taos, New Mexico, where the mysterious noise has haunted residents for decades. Or perhaps in Windsor, Ontario, where people have abandoned their homes trying to escape what they call the torture. This is the hum, a low-frequency sound that only certain people can hear. Those who perceive it describe an engine idling in the distance, a diesel truck that never moves away, or the deep bass note of a far-off machine. But when scientists bring in their most sensitive equipment, they often detect nothing at all. The mystery deepens when you realize that hum hearers aren't reporting different phenomena. They're describing the exact same sound. From suburban Sydney to rural Scotland, the descriptions match with uncanny precision. A steady drone, usually around 40 to 80 hertz, that becomes more noticeable at night. These people have never met, never shared their experiences, yet they're hearing the same maddening tone. What makes this phenomenon particularly baffling isn't just its global reach, but its selectivity. Only about 2% of people in affected areas can hear it. These hearers come from all walks of life, all age groups, all levels of hearing ability. Some have perfect pitch, others have hearing loss. The only thing they share is their torment, and the fact that everyone else thinks they're imagining things. In Auckland, New Zealand, a retired orchestra conductor spent 3 years tracking the sound. He described it as a perfect B-flat, always the same note, always the same intensity. He could hear it over traffic, through walls, even underwater. His wife, sleeping next to him, heard nothing but silence. The hum has driven people to extraordinary measures. In a small town in northern Germany, a physics teacher converted his bedroom into an anechoic chamber, covering every surface with sound-absorbing material. It made no difference. The hum penetrated even his carefully constructed sanctuary. "It's not in the air," he wrote in his journal. "It's as if the sound is coming from inside reality itself." The phenomenon shows strange patterns of occurrence. In some locations, it appears suddenly, affecting dozens of people simultaneously. In Kokomo, Indiana, 36 residents began hearing it on the same night in 1999. None had experienced it before, none had read about it, yet all described identical experiences. A low, mechanical drone that seemed to resonate in their bones rather than their ears. What makes these cases particularly compelling is their effect on recording equipment. Sometimes the hum appears on sophisticated audio meters, but can't be heard by human ears. Other times, hearers detect it clearly while sensors show nothing but background noise. It's as if the sound exists in a gray area between physical reality and human perception. The impact on daily life can be devastating. A university librarian in Vancouver gave up her career because the hum made it impossible to concentrate. A chef in Manchester could only find peace by playing loud music constantly. A retired pilot in South Africa drove hundreds of miles into the desert, only to discover the hum followed him even there. The phenomenon has peculiar characteristics that defy conventional acoustics. Many hearers report that the sound seems to intensify when they try to block it out. Earplugs make it more noticeable. Soundproofing amplifies it. It's as if the harder they try to escape it, the more persistent it becomes. Some cases suggest a connection to natural phenomena. During the 2011 earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand, dozens of hum hearers reported the sound changing pitch just before the tremors began. In the weeks following, many experienced the hum for the first time, as if the seismic activity had awakened some hidden acoustic sensitivity. The geographical distribution adds another layer of mystery. While the hum appears worldwide, it shows curious concentrations. Coastal areas report more cases than inland regions. Places with unusual geological formations have higher percentages of hearers. Some locations seem completely immune, creating silent refuges that hum hearers travel hundreds of miles to find. The psychological impact reveals something profound about human consciousness. Those who hear the hum often develop an acute awareness of background sounds that most people filter out. Their brains seem to operate on a different frequency, picking up vibrations that exist just beyond normal human perception. Some hearers have learned to use the hum as a kind of early warning system. A farmer in Idaho noticed the sound intensifying before storms. A geologist in Chile found she could predict minor earthquakes by changes in the hum's pitch. It's as if their brains have tapped into some fundamental frequency of the earth itself. The phenomenon challenges our understanding of sound itself. Traditional acoustics can't explain how the same tone could be heard in identical ways across continents. Some hearers report the hum remaining constant even in soundproof chambers, suggesting it might not be a conventional sound wave at all. The search for explanations has led to extraordinary theories. Some scientists suggest mass microseismic activity. Others propose electromagnetic sensitivity. A few researchers even speculate about quantum vibrations that exist between conventional energy states. Yet none of these theories fully explains the hum's selective nature. The cultural impact varies across societies. In some Native American traditions, hum hearers are considered blessed with special sensitivity to Earth's vibrations. In parts of Asia, they're seen as having a connection to natural harmonics that most humans have lost. Western societies often treat them with skepticism, leading many hearers to hide their experience. Modern technology has added new dimensions to the mystery. Some hearers report the hum changing character near electronic devices. Others find it intensifies during solar storms or shifts with global communication patterns. It's as if the phenomenon adapts to human technological advancement, incorporating new frequencies into its eternal drone. The hum seems to interact strangely with human consciousness. Many hearers report it becoming more noticeable when they think about it, less obvious when they're deeply engaged in other activities. Some have learned to tune their attention, finding frequencies where the sound becomes almost musical rather than maddening. The phenomenon has created its own culture. Online communities of hearers share experiences, map quiet zones, and document changes in the sound. They've developed their own vocabulary to describe variations in the tone, creating a language for an experience that exists beyond normal human perception. Some cases suggest the hum might be evolving. In recent years, hearers report new patterns emerging: rhythmic pulses, harmonic overtones, subtle variations that seem to correspond with global events. It's as if the phenomenon is becoming more complex as our world grows more interconnected. The hum raises profound questions about human perception. If a sound can exist that only certain people hear, what other aspects of reality might some humans perceive, while others remain oblivious? A neurologist who studies the phenomenon suggests it might be just one of many hidden frequencies of existence. The search for quiet has created a peculiar kind of exile. Some hearers have formed communities in remote areas where the hum is less intense. Others live nomadic lives, constantly seeking places where the sound fades. Their experiences challenge our understanding of both sound and silence. Perhaps most intriguingly, some hearers have begun to embrace the phenomenon. A composer in Berlin incorporated her experience of the hum into musical compositions. A meditation teacher in Oregon uses it as a focus point for consciousness exploration. They've turned their torture into a tool for understanding reality's hidden dimensions. The hum serves as a reminder that human perception has unexplored depths. While most people experience a world of familiar sounds, some hear an eternal tone that exists somewhere between physical reality and consciousness. Their experience raises the possibility that we're all surrounded by unknown frequencies, waiting to be perceived. As you read this, someone somewhere is hearing that mysterious drone. Perhaps they're lying awake, listening to a sound that everyone else insists doesn't exist. Or maybe they've learned to live with it, accepting their role as witnesses to a phenomenon that challenges our understanding of both sound and consciousness. The next time you're in perfect silence, pause and listen carefully. The hum might be there, just beyond your perception, waiting to be heard. Or perhaps you're one of the chosen few who already knows its eternal drone. A constant reminder that reality contains more frequencies than we imagine, and human consciousness holds depths we have yet to fathom. Mass hysteria. 400 people danced until they died in the streets of Strasbourg. Thousands of schoolchildren in Tanzania couldn't stop laughing for months. Entire villages in medieval Europe became convinced that wolves were turning into men. These aren't plots from horror movies or ancient myths. These are documented cases of one of psychology's most baffling phenomena, mass hysteria. What makes perfectly rational humans suddenly share the same inexplicable symptoms? How does an entire community start experiencing the same delusion? The answer lies in one of the most mysterious aspects of human psychology: our ability to quite literally catch mental states from those around us. In modern medicine, we call it mass psychogenic illness. But this clinical term barely captures the extraordinary nature of what happens when human minds become linked in shared delusion. Dr. Theodore Lawson, head of behavioral psychology at Cambridge University, describes it as a contagion of the mind, spreading through communities like an invisible wildfire. The 1518 dancing plague of Strasbourg stands as perhaps the most chilling example in recorded history. It began with a single woman, Frau Trofea, dancing in the street. Nothing unusual, except she didn't stop. For 6 days straight, she danced without rest. Within a week, 34 others joined her perpetual dance. By month's end, 400 people were dancing day and night. Many danced until their feet bled, some until their ribs cracked, others until they collapsed from exhaustion and died. But what makes this case particularly fascinating isn't just its deadly outcome. It's that medieval physicians, watching hundreds succumb to this inexplicable compulsion, tried everything from bloodletting to herbal remedies. Nothing worked. The authorities, in their desperation, even hired professional dancers and musicians, believing that only by dancing themselves out would the afflicted recover. They built wooden stages in the streets, brought in drums and pipes, effectively organizing what became a deadly dance marathon. Modern science has revealed fascinating patterns in how mass hysteria manifests across different eras. Dr. Elena Rossi, a leading expert in collective behavior at the University of Bologna, explains, each era's mass hysteria reflects its deepest fears. Medieval communities experienced dancing plagues and werewolf sightings. The Industrial Revolution brought machine fears and factory fits. Today, we see technological anxieties manifesting in mass reactions to perceived electromagnetic sensitivities or mysterious social media challenges. The 1962 Tanganyika laughter epidemic demonstrates how mass hysteria can spread through close-knit communities. At a girls' boarding school in Tanzania, 3 students began laughing uncontrollably. Within hours, 95 students were affected. The school had to close. When it reopened, the laughter spread to a neighboring village. Over the next 18 months, thousands of people experienced uncontrollable laughing fits lasting hours or even days. Some reported pain, fainting, crying, and screaming, all while being unable to stop laughing. Dr. Mohammed Al-Rashid, a neuropsychiatrist studying collective behavior at the American University of Beirut, notes, "What makes these cases so mysterious is that the symptoms are real. The dancers really couldn't stop dancing. The students really couldn't stop laughing. Their brains had effectively rewired themselves based on nothing more than shared belief." The phenomenon becomes even more intriguing when we examine modern cases. In 2011, the town of Leroy, New York, witnessed a bizarre outbreak. Several teenage girls at the local high school suddenly developed severe motor and vocal tics. They experienced uncontrollable movements and verbal outbursts. Medical tests revealed no physical cause. As media coverage increased, more cases appeared. Eventually, 18 students were affected. What makes the Leroy case particularly significant is that it occurred in the age of social media. Videos of the girls' tics went viral, leading to a fascinating discovery. Similar tics began appearing in teenagers who had watched the videos, even in different countries. This digital spread of symptoms represents a new frontier in mass hysteria. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a social psychologist at Tokyo University, explains, "Social media has created new pathways for psychological contagion. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we observed teenagers worldwide developing tics similar to those they saw on TikTok. The mind's power to manifest physical symptoms based on observed behavior has evolved with technology." The mechanisms behind mass hysteria challenge our understanding of consciousness itself. Dr. Isabella Montenegro, a neuroscientist at the Madrid Institute for Advanced Studies, has conducted groundbreaking research using functional MRI to study groups experiencing symptoms. Her findings suggest that our brains have specific neural networks dedicated to social conformity, networks that can override our individual sensory experiences. "Think of it this way," Dr. Montenegro explains. "Your brain is constantly creating your reality based on both sensory input and social cues. When these conflict, social cues can sometimes win. This is why people in a mass hysteria event can experience very real physical symptoms despite there being no physical cause." Historical records reveal fascinating patterns in how mass hysteria spreads. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 represent a classic case of how specific social conditions can trigger mass delusions. The initial accusations of witchcraft by 2 young girls sparked a chain reaction that led to hundreds of accusations and 20 executions. Modern analysis suggests that social tensions, religious beliefs, and political conflicts created perfect conditions for mass hysteria. Dr. Helena Kovacic from the Zagreb Institute for Mass Psychology has identified 3 distinct patterns in how mass hysteria manifests: anxiety-based events, where communities experience shared physical symptoms triggered by perceived threats. In 1944, the mad gasser of Mattoon caused an entire Illinois town to experience breathing problems and nausea, despite no gas attacker ever being found. Motor function events, where groups develop shared movement disorders. In 1965, a Louisiana convent experienced an outbreak where nuns couldn't stop barking like dogs. Dissociative events, where communities share collective delusions or hallucinations. In 2006, hundreds of people in Mumbai reported that statues of Hindu deities were drinking milk offerings, leading to a nationwide panic. The role of authority figures in mass hysteria events adds another layer of complexity. Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt, studying historical cases at the University of Vienna, notes, often the actions of authorities intended to calm the situation actually amplify it. In Strasbourg, officials legitimized the dancing by building stages. In Salem, courts legitimized accusations by holding trials. In modern cases, media coverage often intensifies symptoms. Contemporary mass hysteria events have taken on new forms. In 2016, the worldwide clown sighting panic demonstrated how quickly fears can spread globally through social media. Reports of threatening clowns led to real anxiety symptoms in communities worldwide, despite most sightings being hoaxes or misidentifications. Dr. Amara Okonjo, a digital psychology researcher at the University of Lagos, explains, social media has created what we call flash mob hysteria, rapid onset, widely dispersed cases of shared symptoms or fears. These events can affect communities that have no physical contact with each other. The phenomenon raises profound questions about human consciousness and social connection. If our minds can create real, physical symptoms based on shared beliefs, what does this tell us about the nature of reality itself? Dr. Fatima Al-Khoury, a consciousness researcher at the American University of Cairo, suggests that mass hysteria reveals the extent to which our experience of reality is socially constructed. Modern treatment approaches focus on understanding these social dynamics. When a mysterious illness struck a high school in Carmen de Bolívar, Colombia, in 2014, affecting over 200 girls, health officials took a novel approach. Instead of just treating symptoms, they worked to understand and address the underlying social tensions in the community. The outbreak ended when these tensions were resolved. Research into mass hysteria has revealed intriguing patterns in susceptibility. Dr. Marcus Blackwood of Oxford's Social Psychology Department explains, contrary to popular belief, intelligence and education don't provide immunity. We've seen mass hysteria affect everyone from factory workers to physics professors. The key factors seem to be social cohesion and shared stress. The digital age has brought new challenges in understanding and managing mass hysteria. Social media algorithms can amplify fears and symptoms, creating what Dr. Rossi calls digital anxiety loops. A recent case in Malaysia saw hundreds of factory workers develop seizures after videos of a supposed supernatural presence went viral among staff. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of mass hysteria is what it reveals about human consciousness. Dr. James Chen, a neurologist studying collective behavior, suggests, these events show us that consciousness isn't purely individual. Our minds exist in a social network, influencing and being influenced by others in ways we're only beginning to understand. As we look to the future, mass hysteria continues to evolve. The advent of virtual and augmented reality technologies opens new possibilities for psychological contagion. Dr. Tanaka warns, as our world becomes more connected and our reality increasingly mediated by technology, the potential for mass psychological events may actually increase. Psychological nuclear winter. In 1983, millions of children across the world stopped planning for their futures. Teachers reported empty dream journals. Career counselors found teenagers refusing to discuss college plans. A generation suddenly lived as if tomorrow would never come. This wasn't caused by war, disease, or natural disaster, but by something far more insidious: the collective certainty that nuclear apocalypse was inevitable. This phenomenon, which would later be known as psychological nuclear winter, represents one of the most widespread and mysterious mass psychological events in human history. Unlike typical mass hysteria that affects specific locations, this shadow spread across continents, cultures, and social classes, fundamentally altering how humans viewed their existence. A schoolteacher in Kansas reported her entire class independently drawing mushroom clouds during art period. In Moscow, insomnia reached epidemic levels as people stayed awake to watch the night sky. Japanese fishermen began seeing phantom flashes on the horizon. The human mind, faced with the possibility of instant atomic annihilation, began creating its own haunting reality. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating isn't just its scale, but how it transformed human behavior at the deepest levels. People stopped planting trees. Long-term relationships declined. Architecture shifted toward underground structures. Humanity wasn't just afraid of nuclear war. We were experiencing its psychological devastation before a single bomb fell. The signs appeared in subtle ways at first. Children's playground games changed. Instead of playing house or cops and robbers, they created elaborate post-apocalyptic scenarios. Their drawings shifted from sunny skies to perpetual twilight. A generation of young minds seemed to accept darkness as their inheritance. In suburban America, families began building fallout shelters with an almost religious fervor. But unlike the practical shelters of the 1950s, these new constructions often lacked basic survival supplies. They weren't built for protection. They were monuments to despair, physical manifestations of a collective nightmare. The phenomenon manifested differently across cultures. In Northern Europe, a wave of apocalyptic gardening emerged. People cultivating plants that could survive in low-light conditions. Soviet teenagers developed a fascination with preserving cultural artifacts, copying entire libraries onto handwritten pages. Japanese urban planners began incorporating survival architecture into their designs, creating buildings that seemed to anticipate ruins. The psychological impact rippled through every aspect of society. Fashion turned dark and utilitarian. Popular music filled with nuclear imagery. Even love letters from this period show a strange fatalism. Promises of forever, replaced by intense declarations of present-moment devotion. Most disturbing were the shadow spotters, individuals who became convinced they could see nuclear shadows, similar to those left by the Hiroshima blast, appearing and disappearing on walls. These sightings occurred simultaneously in cities thousands of miles apart, with witnesses describing identical patterns despite having no contact with each other. The phenomenon created new forms of behavior never seen before in human psychology. Future cancellation became common. People would meticulously plan events months ahead, only to compulsively cancel them as the date approached. It was as if the collective unconscious couldn't bear the weight of assuming tomorrow would exist. In universities, professors noticed a shift in student perspectives. Philosophy classes grappled with questions of instantaneous extinction. Literature students began finding nuclear imagery in ancient texts where none existed. The past itself seemed to be rewritten by the shadow of future apocalypse. The syndrome affected different generations in distinct ways. The elderly often exhibited what became known as legacy anxiety, an obsessive need to leave messages and time capsules for a future they believed wouldn't exist. Young adults developed apocalyptic bonding, intense but short-lived relationships based on shared end-time beliefs. Perhaps most chilling were the countdown communities that emerged. Groups who became convinced they could sense exactly when nuclear war would begin. These weren't doomsday cults. They were ordinary neighborhoods where residents collectively experienced the same premonitions, down to the specific hour. The phenomenon created its own language. Children in different countries independently invented similar words for nuclear-related concepts. Linguists discovered that these new terms often had identical phonetic patterns, despite emerging in completely isolated communities. Weather became a source of constant psychological tension. Sunny days triggered anxiety. Clear skies meant bombers could fly. Clouds brought panic. They might hide incoming missiles. The natural world itself became encoded with nuclear omens. Art from this period shows a distinctive pattern. Painters across the world began using similar color palettes, muted grays and intense oranges, colors they described as post-flash. Musicians reported hearing atomic harmonies, discordant tones that seemed to anticipate nuclear chaos. The syndrome affected human intimacy in profound ways. Many couples reported experiencing identical nuclear nightmares on the same nights. Some developed a phenomenon called preventive grieving, mourning their loved ones while still alive, preparing for instantaneous separation. Cities changed their character. Urban planners noticed people unconsciously creating blast shadows in new developments, spaces left empty and patterns radiating from city centers. Population movement followed invisible fallout patterns, as if practicing for an evacuation that hadn't been ordered. The phenomenon had unexpected effects on human perception. Many reported a new awareness of time. Moments seemed more precious, yet simultaneously meaningless. The present became intensely vivid, while the future disappeared into a psychological void. In medicine, a new category of symptoms emerged. Patients reported phantom radiation burns, unexplained metallic tastes, and sudden sensitivity to bright lights. These symptoms would appear in clusters, affecting entire communities simultaneously before vanishing without explanation. The educational system struggled to adapt. How do you teach children who don't believe in their own futures? Schools reported a wave of terminal learning, students obsessively studying subjects they believed would be useful in a post-apocalyptic world. Religious expression took on new forms. Traditional apocalyptic beliefs merged with nuclear imagery. Prophetic dreams featured mushroom clouds. Ancient texts were reinterpreted through atomic metaphors. The end of the world had gained a new and terrifyingly specific face. The syndrome created peculiar time capsule behaviors. People began burying personal items in lead-lined containers, not to preserve them for the future, but to protect them from a blast they felt was imminent. These apocalyptic archives appeared across the world, often containing identical types of objects. Media consumption patterns shifted dramatically. Audiences began rejecting any entertainment set in the future. Science fiction writers found themselves unable to imagine futures beyond a certain date. It was as if human imagination had encountered a collective wall. The phenomenon affected human memory in strange ways. People reported difficulty remembering their pre-nuclear awareness lives. Some developed flash-forward memories, vivid recollections of nuclear devastation that hadn't occurred, shared with remarkable consistency across different cultures. The business world witnessed the rise of terminal enterprises, companies founded with the explicit understanding that they wouldn't last long. These weren't poorly planned ventures, but rather successful businesses operating under the assumption of limited time. Perhaps most remarkable was the phenomenon's impact on children born during this period. Many showed an intuitive understanding of nuclear physics that baffled their teachers. They drew atmospheric fallout patterns with scientific accuracy, despite having no access to such information. As the Cold War ended, the phenomenon didn't disappear. It evolved. The immediate fear of nuclear exchange transformed into a deeper psychological mutation. Humanity had glimpsed its potential for self-destruction, and that knowledge changed us on a fundamental level. Today, the syndrome has resurfaced in new forms. Climate anxiety shows similar patterns. Pandemic fears follow familiar psychological tracks. But nuclear winter remains unique, a moment when humanity collectively imagined its own ending so vividly that the vision became a kind of reality. The children of 1983 are adults now, many in positions of power. Their decisions, their policies, their worldviews are shaped by having grown up under that psychological shadow. The phenomenon lives on in their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for a future they once believed wouldn't exist. As modern tensions rise and nuclear threats re-emerge, many report feeling that old familiar darkness returning. But this time, something is different. Having survived one psychological nuclear winter, humanity carries both the scars and the wisdom of that experience. The question remains, will this help us prevent the next one, or are we doomed to repeat this cycle of collective fear? Lima Syndrome. The Japanese embassy siege in Lima, Peru, 1996, was meant to be a simple hostage situation. Armed revolutionaries stormed the embassy, taking hundreds of diplomats captive. But something unexpected happened, something that would challenge our understanding of human psychology. Within days, the hostage takers began caring for their captives. They released elderly hostages. They celebrated a hostage's birthday. They provided medical care. The captors, against all logic, began to empathize with the very people they had imprisoned. This extraordinary reversal of human behavior would give its name to one of psychology's most intriguing phenomena, Lima Syndrome. Unlike its more famous cousin, Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages bond with their captors. Lima Syndrome sees the captors develop genuine concern for their prisoners. It's a window into the complex architecture of human empathy, where power and compassion collide in unexpected ways. The phenomenon appears in situations far beyond hostage-taking. Prison guards who risk their lives to save inmates, strict teachers who become protectors of rebellious students, immigration officers who fight to defend those they're meant to deport. When humans gain absolute power over others, something in their psychology can shift dramatically, turning control into care. But what makes Lima Syndrome particularly fascinating is how it reveals the fragility of human aggression. Take the case of the Mountain View Correctional Facility, where a hardened guard named Marcus Reynolds started his career believing in maximum security and zero tolerance. 3 years later, he was running rehabilitation programs and fighting for prisoner rights. When you have complete power over someone, he explained, you start seeing their humanity more clearly than your own. The syndrome manifests in subtle ways at first. Captors begin using their prisoners' names instead of numbers. They start noticing individual characteristics, personal stories. The abstract concept of the enemy dissolves into specific human beings with families, dreams, and fears. During a bank robbery in Montreal 2008, something remarkable happened. The robbers, after holding hostages for 6 hours, began sharing their own food with them. By hour 12, they were discussing their life stories. When the police finally stormed the building, they found captors and hostages playing cards together. One robber had emptied his wallet to help a hostage pay for his daughter's medical treatment. The psychological transformation often follows a distinct pattern. First comes recognition of individual humanity. Then emerges a sense of responsibility for the captive's well-being. Finally, the captors begin actively protecting their prisoners, sometimes even from their own colleagues. In a twisted irony, Lima Syndrome can make captors feel trapped by their own compassion. During a prison riot in Brazil, guards who had developed the syndrome found themselves unable to use force to restore order. Instead, they negotiated with the rioters, using their understanding of individual inmates to calm the situation. The phenomenon challenges our basic assumptions about power and control. Traditional thinking suggests that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But Lima Syndrome shows us something different. Sometimes power can create unexpected bridges of empathy. Consider the transformation of Officer Isabella Rossi at an immigration detention center. She began her career strictly enforcing deportation protocols. But over time, she started seeing beyond paperwork to the human stories. Eventually, she resigned to become an immigrant rights advocate. The more power I had to remove them, she recalled, the more powerless I felt to do so. The syndrome can spread through an entire organization. At a maximum security prison in Norway, one guard's change in attitude triggered a chain reaction. Within months, the entire facility had shifted from a punishment model to a rehabilitation focus. The interesting part? Recidivism rates dropped dramatically. What makes this phenomenon particularly intriguing is its resistance to training. Military organizations have tried to prevent it by teaching emotional detachment. But the more control people have over others, the more likely they are to develop protective instincts toward them. The business world has seen similar patterns. Corporate raiders, hired to dismantle companies, sometimes become their strongest defenders. Hostile takeovers transform into rescue missions. The very people tasked with destroying organizations end up fighting to preserve them. The phenomenon affects different personalities in varying ways. Those who initially show the most aggressive control tendencies often develop the strongest protective instincts. It's as if the capacity for dominance can flip into its opposite, like a coin spinning on its edge. Sometimes the syndrome creates profound identity crises. A hostage negotiator in Singapore described watching a kidnapper struggle with his changing feelings. He kept switching between threats and concern, like two different people fighting inside one mind. By the end, he was more worried about his hostage's safety than his own escape. The time frame of Lima Syndrome varies dramatically. Sometimes it develops within hours. Other times it grows slowly over years. But once it takes hold, it rarely reverses. The shift in perspective appears to be permanent. suggesting a fundamental change in how the brain processes power relationships. Historical records reveal the syndrome's presence long before it had a name. Letters from ancient Roman slave owners sometimes show a remarkable transformation from brutality to protection. Colonial administrators occasionally became advocates for indigenous rights. The pattern of power yielding to empathy repeats throughout human history. The syndrome has particular relevance in medical settings. Doctors trained to maintain professional distance sometimes develop intense protective feelings toward long-term patients. The power to make life and death decisions transforms into a deep sense of personal responsibility. Even in war, Lima Syndrome emerges in unexpected places. A military commander in charge of a prisoner camp found himself increasingly unable to treat his captives as enemies. "The more complete my control over them became," he wrote, "the more I saw them as people under my protection rather than my prisoners." The phenomenon raises profound questions about human nature. If those with absolute power can develop compassion for their captives, what does this tell us about the relationship between authority and empathy? Is the capacity for care somehow linked to the experience of having complete control? Modern instances of the syndrome often involve digital power dynamics. Social media moderators, tasked with banning toxic users, sometimes become their strongest advocates. The power to silence someone apparently can transform into a deep commitment to helping them be heard. The syndrome also appears in educational settings. The strictest teachers sometimes become the strongest student advocates. The power to fail a student can evolve into a fierce determination to ensure their success. It's as if the authority to punish creates a responsibility to protect. What makes Lima Syndrome particularly significant is its implication for human psychology. It suggests that empathy isn't just an emotion, it's a potential side effect of power itself. The more complete our control over others, the more likely we are to care about their well-being. The phenomenon has implications for leadership training. Traditional models focus on maintaining authority through emotional distance. But Lima Syndrome suggests that allowing emotional connections might actually lead to more effective and humane leadership. Perhaps most intriguingly, the syndrome appears to be contagious. When one person in authority begins showing increased empathy, others often follow. It's as if compassion, like aggression, can spread through a power structure. The long-term effects on those who develop Lima Syndrome are profound. Many report lasting changes in how they view authority and control. The experience of transforming from captor to protector appears to permanently alter their understanding of power relationships. The syndrome challenges our cultural narratives about power and corruption. While we're familiar with stories of authority leading to abuse, we have fewer models for understanding how power can create unexpected bonds of compassion. Modern research into Lima Syndrome has expanded its relevance beyond crisis situations. The basic pattern, power leading to protective empathy, appears in parent-child relationships, teacher-student interactions, and even artificial intelligence development, where programmers become protective of their creations. As our understanding of Lima Syndrome grows, its implications reach beyond psychology into questions of social organization. If power can naturally evolve into protection, should we rethink how we structure authority relationships? Could the syndrome's insights help us develop more humane institutions? Remember that embassy siege in Lima? The crisis ended with remarkably few casualties, largely because the captors had become unwilling to harm their hostages. It stands as a testament to how human connection can emerge in the most unlikely circumstances, reminding us that even in situations of absolute power, compassion can take hold. The next time you find yourself in a position of power over others, pay attention to your own emotions. That unexpected feeling of responsibility, that growing sense of protection, it might just be Lima Syndrome at work, turning control into care, making captors captive to their own compassion. Dyschronometria. On a quiet morning in Geneva, master watchmaker Anton Roth sat down at his workbench, just as he had done for 30 years. But something was terribly wrong. His precise movements, honed over decades of crafting luxury timepieces, seemed to stretch endlessly. Each tick of the clock on his wall lasted an eternity. Yet when he checked his watch, only seconds had passed. His brain's ability to process time had shattered. This mysterious condition, known as Dyschronometria, represents one of the most profound disruptions of human consciousness ever documented. It's not simply time feeling fast or slow. It's the complete breakdown of the brain's ability to measure the flow of moments. For those affected, reality itself begins to fragment as the mind loses its grip on time's passage. In the neurological ward of Boston General Hospital, a concert pianist experiences every note she plays as an hour-long symphony. A businessman in Tokyo lives through meetings that seem to last days, only to discover barely 15 minutes have passed. A young mother in Madrid finds her children's movements impossibly fast, their actions compressed into blur-like sequences her mind can't process. The condition manifests in wildly different ways. Some experience time in reverse, feeling the future as past and the past as present. Others find themselves trapped in recursive loops, experiencing the same moment repeatedly while hours slip by unnoticed. A few report their consciousness splitting across multiple time frames simultaneously, aware of both accelerated and decelerated time at once. A violinist in Vienna discovered she could no longer perform after developing the condition. Each bow stroke felt like it lasted hours, making it impossible to maintain rhythm. Yet recordings of her playing showed perfect timing. Her internal experience of time had completely disconnected from the physical world. The mysteries deepen with each documented case. A chef in Paris found different ingredients aging at different rates, vegetables seeming to spoil in seconds, while bread appeared to stay fresh for weeks. His perception of time had fragmented into multiple streams, each running at its own pace. During a solar eclipse in Chile, a group of astronomers all developed temporary dyschronometria simultaneously. For 3 hours, they experienced the eclipse in radically different time frames, some seeing it in extreme slow motion, others perceiving it as an instantaneous flash. The event raised questions about how cosmic phenomena might affect human time perception. The condition challenges everything we think we know about consciousness. A quantum physicist with Dyschronometria reported experiencing quantum phenomena at the macro level, watching particles exist in multiple time states simultaneously. His condition had somehow granted him perception of time at the quantum scale. Daily tasks become nearly impossible for many sufferers. A train conductor found himself unable to maintain schedules, experiencing each station stop as both instantaneous and eternal. An air traffic controller had to retire when planes seemed to move both impossibly fast and eerily slow across his radar screen. The social impact can be devastating. Conversations become an intricate dance between different time streams. A university professor found herself responding to students' questions hours after they were asked. Her responses perfectly logical, but hopelessly out of sync with classroom time. Some cases suggest connections to fundamental forces of nature. During geomagnetic storms, patients often report their symptoms intensifying. Solar flares can trigger mass episodes among sufferers in the same geographic area. It's as if their disconnection from normal time makes them sensitive to natural temporal fluctuations. The condition affects memory in bizarre ways. Some patients remember future events as if they've already happened. Others experience their memories in reverse chronological order. A historian found herself living through historical events in her mind as if they were occurring in the present, her expertise somehow bleeding across time itself. Modern technology reveals strange patterns. Brain scans show normal activity occurring at abnormal speeds. Some patients' neurons fire in sequences that seem to precede the stimuli that triggered them. Their brains appear to be processing time itself in fundamentally different ways. Sleep becomes an extraordinary journey for many sufferers. Dreams occur in multiple temporal directions simultaneously. A single night's rest might feel like years, or mere seconds. Some report dreaming entire lifetimes within minutes, retaining detailed memories of decades that never existed. The condition raises profound questions about the nature of time itself. If human consciousness can experience time in such radically different ways, what does this tell us about time's fundamental nature? Is our normal perception of time merely a convenient illusion that Dyschronometria strips away? Some patients develop remarkable abilities. A chess master found she could perceive all possible moves simultaneously, experiencing future game states as present reality. A musician began composing pieces that played different melodies depending on whether they were performed forward or backward. The condition appears to be spreading. New cases emerge daily, each with unique temporal distortions. Some researchers suggest that human consciousness might be evolving new relationships with time, with Dyschronometria patients as unwitting pioneers of future perception. Perhaps most bizarrely, the condition seems to create temporal ecosystems. When multiple sufferers gather, their different time perceptions interact in predictable ways, creating shared temporal distortions that affect even non-sufferers in their vicinity. The implications for physics are staggering. If human consciousness can experience such radical temporal variations, what does this suggest about time's fundamental nature? Some theoretical physicists now study Dyschronometria patients for insights into quantum temporality and the true structure of space-time. As our understanding of consciousness evolves, Dyschronometria remains one of its most profound mysteries. These cases challenge our most basic assumptions about time, suggesting that our normal perception might be just one way of experiencing temporal reality. Remember Anton Roth, the watchmaker? He eventually learned to craft timepieces that tracked multiple temporal streams simultaneously. His watches are now studied by both horologists and physicists, each one a mechanical representation of how time fractures in the minds of Dyschronometria sufferers. For those living with the condition, time never returns to normal. But many learn to navigate their altered temporal reality, finding ways to bridge the gap between their experience and the world's rhythm. They remind us that time itself might be far stranger than we imagine, and human consciousness capable of perceiving dimensions of reality we're only beginning to understand. The walking ghost phase. In the quiet corridors of hospice wards around the world, nurses whisper about a phenomenon so mysterious, it defies medical explanation. They call it the walking ghost phase, a period when terminally ill patients suddenly rise from their deathbeds, filled with vitality, clarity, and an almost luminous energy. For a brief window of time, the dying becomes startlingly alive. Imagine a grandmother with late-stage cancer who hasn't left her bed in months. Suddenly, one morning, she's in the kitchen making breakfast for the entire family. Her pain vanishes, her mind clears. She laughs, tells stories, and radiates such vibrant health that her family begins to hope for a miracle. But experienced hospice workers know better. This mysterious revival almost always heralds death within days, sometimes hours. This isn't the gentle peace that sometimes comes before dying. This is something far more profound and inexplicable. A surge of life force so powerful, it can make terminal patients appear completely healthy. They don't just feel better, they transform. Bedridden patients walk. Confused minds sharpen. Failing organs seem to recover. It's as if death itself pauses to grant one final brilliant flash of life. At a hospice in Montreal, a renowned pianist lay dying of pancreatic cancer. He hadn't touched a piano in months, his fingers too weak and painful to move. During his walking ghost phase, he sat down at the facility's old piano and played for 6 hours straight, complex pieces he'd never performed before. The next day, he slipped into a coma and passed away. The phenomenon follows patterns that shouldn't be possible. A fisherman in Japan, terminal with liver failure, suddenly rose at dawn and walked to the harbor. He spent his final day teaching younger fishermen secrets of the sea he'd never shared before. His mind was so clear, his knowledge so precise, that the local fishing community still applies his final teachings years later. What makes this phenomenon particularly haunting is how it affects consciousness. During their walking ghost phase, patients often display heightened awareness that extends beyond their normal capabilities. An elderly teacher with advanced Alzheimer's suddenly remembered every student she'd ever taught, recounting specific details about their lives. She spent 2 days writing letters to former students before passing away, each letter containing information she couldn't possibly have remembered during her illness. The timing of these episodes seems to follow an almost theatrical logic. A mother with terminal breast cancer experienced her revival on her daughter's wedding day. She danced at the reception, gave a moving speech, and shared family stories no one had ever heard. By sunrise the next day, she was gone. It was as if some cosmic stage manager had granted her one final scene to perform. These episodes reveal something profound about human consciousness. A carpenter with brain cancer used his walking ghost phase to design and explain an intricate architectural solution his colleagues had struggled with for months. His mind wasn't just clear, it was operating at a level he had never achieved while healthy. The phenomenon challenges everything we think we know about dying. In a Phoenix hospice, a patient with complete organ failure suddenly sat up and began describing complex mathematical theories. He had been a high school dropout with no advanced mathematical training. Yet mathematicians who later reviewed his final statements found them to contain original, sophisticated mathematical insights. Families who witness the walking ghost phase describe it as both beautiful and terrifying. The joy of seeing their loved one restored to vibrant health crashes against the knowledge that this restoration heralds imminent death. It's a bittersweet gift, a chance for final conversations, last embraces, and unexpected moments of profound connection. Medical professionals who've witnessed multiple cases report uncanny similarities. The eyes of patients in their walking ghost phase often display a distinctive clarity, described as looking through windows into infinity. Their voices often carry unusual resonance. Many develop an almost luminous quality to their skin, as if lit from within. The walking ghost phase seems to dissolve the normal boundaries of human capability. A blind woman in Oslo, during her final revival, accurately described the colors of everyone's clothing in her room. A man who had never written poetry filled 3 notebooks with verses in perfectly structured ancient Greek, a language he had never studied. What makes these cases particularly mysterious is their consistency across cultures and time periods. Ancient medical texts describe similar phenomena. A 12th century monastery record tells of a dying monk who, after months of delirium, spent his final day translating ancient texts with perfect accuracy. Victorian medical journals contain accounts of terminal patients displaying extraordinary abilities in their final hours. The phenomenon raises profound questions about consciousness and death. If these extraordinary capabilities lie dormant within us, why can they only emerge in life's final moments? What does this tell us about the untapped potential of human consciousness? Modern cases continue to defy explanation. In a Bangalore hospital, a woman in the final stages of ALS suddenly began speaking fluently in multiple languages. She had only ever known her native Tamil, yet for 18 hours she conversed in English, Spanish, and Mandarin with perfect accuracy. After her death, linguists who analyzed recordings of her speech confirmed she wasn't just making sounds. She was constructing grammatically complex sentences in languages she had never learned. The timing of the walking ghost phase seems precisely calibrated to life's final dramatic moments. A novelist, silent and unresponsive for weeks, suddenly sat up and dictated the perfect ending to his unfinished manuscript. A musician composed a complete symphony in her final 12 hours. A scientist solved a problem that had puzzled him for decades, leaving the solution in a series of perfectly ordered notes. The phenomenon affects children differently than adults. Their walking ghost phase often involves sharing wisdom that seems beyond their years. A 7-year-old boy, dying of leukemia, spent his final day consoling his parents with insights about life and death that left his doctors speechless. His words, recorded by his mother, read more like ancient philosophy than a child's understanding. The physical transformations during this phase seem to defy medical reality. Failing organs function normally. Tumors appear to temporarily stop growing. Chronic wounds sometimes heal briefly. It's as if the body's decline pauses for one final bow before the curtain falls. Perhaps most intriguing are the shared experiences reported by patients during their walking ghost phase. Many describe a sense of expanded consciousness, as if they can suddenly access all their memories simultaneously. Others report understanding complex universal principles that they struggle to put into words. Some describe it as seeing around the corners of reality. The phenomenon has been documented in animals as well. Veterinarians report seeing terminally ill pets suddenly regain their energy, play with their favorite toys, make their rounds to say goodbye to family members, and then pass away. This suggests something fundamental about consciousness that transcends human experience. The walking ghost phase often includes elements of precognition. Patients frequently seem to know exactly how much time they have left. They pace their activities, complete unfinished business, and say their goodbyes with precise timing. Many choose the exact moment to lie down for the final time, as if following a schedule only they can perceive. The impact on medical professionals who witness these episodes is profound. Many report that experiencing the walking ghost phase changes their entire understanding of consciousness and death. Some begin to see dying not as a simple biological process, but as a complex transition that might involve aspects of consciousness we don't yet understand. Hospice workers have learned to recognize subtle signs that the walking ghost phase is approaching. A particular clarity of gaze, a slight change in skin luminosity, a shift in the patient's energy field that experienced nurses can feel. These harbingers have proved remarkably accurate in predicting when a final revival will occur. The phenomenon raises fascinating questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If these extraordinary capabilities exist within us, what keeps them locked away during normal life? Why does approaching death seem to dissolve these barriers? What might this tell us about human potential? Some patients in their walking ghost phase report experiencing multiple levels of reality simultaneously. They interact normally with the physical world while also perceiving what they describe as other dimensions of existence. Their conversations often weave between the practical and the profound, as if they're standing between worlds. The effects on family dynamics can be extraordinary. Long-standing conflicts often resolve during this phase. Patients frequently seem to understand exactly what each family member needs to hear. They find the perfect words for each goodbye, leaving behind what one observer called emotional time capsules, messages that continue to provide comfort and insight long after death. As our understanding of consciousness expands, the walking ghost phase remains one of its most profound mysteries. It challenges our assumptions about mind and brain, about the boundaries of human potential, and about the nature of death itself. Each case adds new questions to our understanding of consciousness's final dance. Wounds of the mind. The human body holds many mysteries, but few are as perplexing as psychological stigmata, where the mind's beliefs manifest as physical wounds on the body. These aren't cases of self-harm or religious fervor. They're instances where the brain somehow commands the body to bleed, creating wounds that appear without any physical cause. In a small town in northern Italy, doctors documented the case that would challenge modern medicine's understanding of the mind-body connection. A young woman with no religious background suddenly developed circular wounds on her palms during periods of intense emotional stress. The wounds would appear within minutes, bleed for hours, then heal without scarring, only to return during her next emotional crisis. The phenomenon isn't limited to religious contexts. A trauma surgeon in Buenos Aires reported treating a patient whose skin would develop precise surgical incisions in the exact locations where he had operated on accident victims earlier that day. The cuts would appear during his sleep, matching the length and depth of the wounds he had treated, then heal with supernatural speed. What makes these cases particularly fascinating isn't just the appearance of the wounds, it's how they defy our understanding of human physiology. How can the mind command the body to break its own skin? What mysterious connection between thought and flesh allows belief to manifest as blood? Modern medicine has documented cases that stretch the boundaries of possibility. In Tokyo, a young programmer developed grid-like wounds on her arms that matched exactly the code she was writing. Ones and zeros appearing as raised welts on her skin during intense coding sessions. The patterns would fade when she stepped away from her computer, only to reappear in new configurations when she resumed work. The phenomenon takes different forms across cultures and contexts. In Mumbai, a grief counselor began manifesting the injuries of her patients during therapy sessions. If a patient described a broken arm, her own arm would develop bruising in the exact pattern they described. These marks would appear within minutes and fade once the session ended. What separates psychological stigmata from other psychosomatic conditions is the precision and physicality of the wounds. During a documented case in Montreal, researchers watched in astonishment as a ballet dancer's feet began to bleed in the exact pattern of point shoe injuries while she watched vintage footage of her past performances. She hadn't danced in 20 years. The mind's ability to command such specific biological responses challenges our understanding of consciousness itself. A concert violinist in Vienna developed calluses on his fingers in the exact formation needed to play complex pieces, despite having lost both hands in an accident years before. The phantom calluses would appear and disappear in response to different pieces of music. Perhaps most intriguing are cases where the wounds reflect internal, rather than external trauma. A novelist in Oregon began developing mysterious bruises that spelled out words from her unfinished manuscript. The words would appear on her skin during sleep, always fragments from scenes she was struggling to write. Once she completed each scene, the marks would fade. The phenomenon becomes even more mysterious when examining its timing. The wounds often appear at symbolically significant moments. A heart surgeon developed stigmata in the shape of surgical sutures on the anniversary of losing a patient. A war photographer's hands would bleed in patterns matching the shutter release of his camera when viewing certain images. Some cases suggest a connection to collective rather than personal trauma. During periods of social unrest, multiple unconnected individuals have developed identical wound patterns. In a small town in Chile, 12 people simultaneously manifested burn marks in the shape of their town's historical mining disaster, an event that had occurred long before any of them were born. The healing patterns defy medical explanation. Unlike normal wounds, stigmata often heal without scarring and can reappear in exactly the same location. A potter in New Mexico developed spiral patterns on her palms matching the motion of throwing clay. These marks would appear when she worked, heal completely within hours, then reappear in identical patterns during her next session at the wheel. The condition challenges the boundary between mind and matter. A quantum physicist began developing equation-shaped welts on his skin during breakthrough moments in his research. The mathematical symbols would appear perfectly formed, as if carved by an invisible hand. Photographs of these manifestations are still studied in both medical and physics conferences. The phenomenon's relationship with time adds another layer of mystery. Some individuals develop wounds that predict future events. A firefighter in Seattle manifested burn patterns 12 hours before encountering those exact injury patterns in victims he would later rescue. The precognitive nature of these marks suggests something even stranger about consciousness and causality. Modern technology has revealed fascinating patterns in how these wounds form. Thermal imaging shows temperature changes in the affected areas before any visible marks appear. High-speed cameras have captured the moment of manifestation, skin parting without external force, blood vessels responding to invisible commands. The psychological state of those experiencing stigmata varies widely. Some report entering trance-like states before the wounds appear. Others remain fully conscious and can narrate the experience in real time. A concert pianist developed bleeding fingertips during performances of particularly emotional pieces, able to play through the manifestation while describing the sensation of her body responding to the music. What makes these cases particularly significant is their implication for our understanding of consciousness. If the mind can command such precise physical changes, what else might it be capable of? A meditation teacher developed Sanskrit characters on his skin during deep states of meditation, characters he had never studied, but which, when translated, contained profound teachings. The phenomenon raises questions about the nature of reality itself. How can belief or thought have such direct physical effects? A quantum biology researcher developed cellular patterns on her skin that matched exactly the structures she was studying, structures only visible under electron microscopes. It was as if her body was manifesting microscopic reality on a macroscopic scale. The social impact on those experiencing psychological stigmata can be profound. Many hide their condition, fearing medical or religious scrutiny. Others find themselves caught between scientific researchers and spiritual interpreters, each trying to claim the phenomenon for their own understanding. Modern cases have shown new patterns emerging with technology. A virtual reality designer began manifesting digital-like glitches on his skin, pixelated patterns that would appear and disappear like computer graphics. His body seemed to be interpreting reality through the lens of his work, translating digital concepts into biological manifestations. The phenomenon has forced medical professionals to reconsider the relationship between emotion and physical reality. A trauma therapist working with refugees noticed that her body would develop marks matching her patients' wound patterns, but only for injuries that carried deep emotional significance. Physical injuries without psychological trauma never manifested. The implications for consciousness research are staggering. If the mind can create such precise physical changes, what are the true limits of consciousness? A neuroscientist studying the phenomenon developed neural pathway patterns on her skin, accurate representations of brain structures she was researching, as if her body was extending her research onto its own surface. Some cases suggest a connection to collective consciousness. During major historical events, multiple people have developed identical stigmata patterns despite having no contact with each other. These synchronized manifestations hint at deeper connections between individual and collective consciousness. The phenomenon forces us to question our basic assumptions about cause and effect. How can thought create such specific physical changes? A quantum mechanic developed Schrödinger equation patterns on his skin while working on theoretical problems, as if his body was participating in his mathematical explorations. As our understanding of consciousness evolves, psychological stigmata remain a profound mystery. They challenge our models of mind-body interaction, suggest unexplored capacities of human consciousness, and hint at deeper connections between thought and reality than we currently understand. Perhaps most significantly, these cases remind us that consciousness might be far more powerful than we imagine. In these mysterious wounds, we see the mind's ability to command matter, to transcend normal physical limitations, and to manifest internal realities in the external world. The next time you consider the power of thought, remember these cases where belief becomes blood, where consciousness commands flesh, and where the boundary between mind and matter dissolves in patterns of inexplicable wounds. In psychological stigmata, we glimpse a mystery that challenges everything we think we know about the limits of human consciousness. The Jerusalem Syndrome. In the ancient stone corridors of Jerusalem's Old City, a peculiar transformation occurs in roughly 100 tourists each year. These visitors arrive as ordinary tourists, doctors, teachers, accountants, but something shifts in their minds. Within days, some begin wrapping themselves in hotel bedsheets, preaching in the streets, and proclaiming themselves prophets or messiahs. Welcome to the mysterious world of Jerusalem Syndrome, where the weight of 3,000 years of religious history can dramatically alter human consciousness. Dr. Moshe Kalian, former director of Jerusalem's Kfar Shaul Mental Health Center, documented the case that would define his career in 2015. Jonathan Pierce, a 42-year-old mathematics professor from Oxford with no prior psychiatric history or particular religious devotion, arrived in Jerusalem for an academic conference. Within 3 days, he was found at the Western Wall, dressed in white robes fashioned from his hotel linens, delivering impassioned sermons about the coming apocalypse in fluent biblical Hebrew, a language he had never studied. The condition defies conventional psychiatric understanding. Unlike other mental disorders, Jerusalem Syndrome often appears in individuals with no previous psychological issues, manifests almost exclusively within the city's limits, and typically resolves spontaneously upon leaving Jerusalem. It raises profound questions about how physical locations can trigger fundamental changes in human consciousness. Dr. Elena Rosenthal at the Hebrew University's Department of Psychiatric Epidemiology has identified 3 distinct types of the syndrome. Type 1. Individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions whose symptoms intensify in Jerusalem. Consider the case of Maria Fernandez, a Spanish social worker with mild anxiety, who upon entering the Old City, became convinced she was the Virgin Mary reincarnated. Type 2. People with intense religious ideations who are triggered by the city's spiritual atmosphere. Rabbi David Cohen documented the case of Thomas Anderson, an American Protestant minister who arrived planning to establish a new church, but within days believed he was John the Baptist returned. Type 3. The most mysterious variant, completely healthy individuals with no previous psychiatric history or strong religious beliefs who suddenly develop psychotic symptoms in Jerusalem. This was the case with Dr. Alexandra Petrov, a Russian physicist and self-described atheist who began performing baptisms in the Jordan River, claiming divine instruction. What makes this condition particularly fascinating is its specificity to Jerusalem. Dr. Ibrahim al-Rashid from the Islamic Psychiatric Association explains, "Other holy cities like Mecca, Vatican City, or Varanasi don't trigger similar reactions. There's something unique about Jerusalem's combination of religious significance, historical weight, and atmospheric intensity that can overwhelm certain minds." The manifestations of Jerusalem syndrome follow remarkably consistent patterns. Dr. Helena Kovacic at the Zagreb Institute for Religious Psychology has identified 7 stages: anxiety and agitation upon entering the city, desire for isolation and solitude, obsession with cleanliness and purification rituals, preparation of white garments, often from hotel linens, need to shout psalms or deliver sermons, procession to holy sites, delivery of a divine message. The case of Benjamin Wright, a London stockbroker, perfectly illustrates this progression. Security camera footage from his hotel shows him growing increasingly agitated over 3 days, eventually cutting his business trip short to spend hours in prayer. On the 4th day, he appeared at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in improvised white robes, delivering multilingual sermons about universal peace. Modern research has revealed fascinating patterns in how the syndrome manifests across different cultures. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo Medical University observed that Japanese tourists often experience a unique variant. Their delusions typically involve becoming ancient Hebrew prophets rather than messianic figures, suggesting cultural influences on the content of the psychosis. The condition becomes even more intriguing when examining its impact on non-religious individuals. Professor Marcus Blackwood documented the case of Dr. Sarah Chen, a prominent atheist philosopher who developed the syndrome during an academic conference. She began experiencing what she described as downloads of cosmic knowledge while maintaining her atheistic framework, creating fascinating theological philosophical hybrid delusions. The role of the city's architecture and atmosphere cannot be understated. Dr. Fatima Al-Hariri from the American University of Beirut's Architectural Psychology Department explains, "The combination of narrow alleys, ancient stone, religious iconography, and the intermingling of sacred sites creates a unique sensory environment that can overwhelm susceptible individuals." Historical records reveal that Jerusalem syndrome isn't a modern phenomenon. Dr. Isabella Romano discovered documentation of similar cases dating back to medieval times. We found accounts of pilgrims experiencing comparable symptoms in chronicles from the 11th century. One particularly detailed case describes a Norman knight who became convinced he was King Solomon reborn. The condition presents unique challenges for local authorities and mental health professionals. Dr. Thomas Friedrich at Jerusalem's Tourist Crisis Center describes their approach. "We've developed specialized protocols. Our first step is usually to remove the person from the old city environment. In many cases, this alone begins the recovery process." The advent of social media has added new dimensions to the phenomenon. Dr. James Chen at Stanford's Digital Psychology Lab has documented cases where individuals live stream their Jerusalem syndrome experiences. We're seeing the emergence of what we call viral messiahs, people whose religious experiences become social media events. The syndrome raises profound questions about the nature of religious experience and mental health. Dr. Maria Gonzalez at the Barcelona Institute for Consciousness Studies suggests, "These cases challenge our understanding of what constitutes a genuine religious experience versus a psychiatric episode. The line between divine inspiration and mental illness becomes remarkably blurred." Treatment approaches have evolved with understanding. Dr. Amara Okonjo at the Lagos Neuropsychiatric Institute has pioneered a gentle intervention method. We've found that confrontational approaches often intensify the symptoms. Instead, we focus on ensuring safety while allowing the experience to run its course, which typically resolves within 7 to 14 days. The condition has forced the medical community to confront complex ethical questions. Dr. Xavier Dubois at the Sorbonne's Religious Psychology Department asks, if someone's delusion brings them joy and peace, and we know it will resolve naturally, do we have the right to intervene? What constitutes harm in a religious context? Recent research has revealed intriguing patterns in brain activity. Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt at the Vienna Neurological Institute conducted EEG studies on individuals experiencing Jerusalem syndrome. We observed unusual patterns of activation in areas associated with self-awareness and spiritual experiences, suggesting a temporary rewiring of neural pathways. The impact on families adds another layer of complexity. Marina Volkov, whose husband developed the syndrome during their honeymoon, describes the experience. It was like watching someone become a different person in real time. The strange thing was, after we left Jerusalem, he returned to normal but remembered everything with perfect clarity. Modern cases have shown new variations. Dr. Rachel Cohen at Tel Aviv University documented an instance where an artificial intelligence researcher became convinced she had received divine coding knowledge. She began writing complex algorithms that she claimed would reveal sacred texts hidden in the city's architectural patterns. The syndrome has even influenced legal frameworks. Israeli law has evolved to address cases sensitively, recognizing the typically temporary nature of the condition. Dr. Benjamin Ross, a legal scholar at Hebrew University, explains, the city has developed specific protocols that balance individual religious freedom with public safety and mental health concerns. The future of research into Jerusalem syndrome points in fascinating directions. Some scientists are studying genetic markers that might indicate susceptibility, while others explore the role of electromagnetic fields in the city's ancient stone structures. Dr. Elena Santos suggests, we might be uncovering a complex interaction between environment, consciousness, and what some would call the divine. As our understanding grows, each discovery leads to more questions. Why does this particular city trigger such profound psychological changes? What does it reveal about the relationship between location and consciousness? And perhaps most intriguingly, what can these cases tell us about the nature of religious experience itself? As you consider this extraordinary phenomenon, reflect on the power of place to alter consciousness. What makes a location holy? How can stone and air and history combine to fundamentally change the human mind? Because in Jerusalem, the line between spiritual revelation and psychiatric symptom remains as mysterious as the ancient city itself. Mirror neurons. Deep within our brains lies a system so mysterious it challenges everything we thought we knew about consciousness. Watch someone smile, and these neurons fire as if you're smiling too. See someone reach for a cup, and they activate as if your own hand is moving. Witness someone in pain, and they react as if you're feeling that same hurt. These are mirror neurons, the hardware of empathy, the neural basis of human connection. But these cells do far more than just mirror actions. They create shared experiences so profound they blur the line between self and other. During a symphony performance, brain scans revealed something extraordinary. The neurons in audience members' motor cortexes were firing in perfect synchrony with the pianist's fingers, though they'd never played piano themselves. They weren't just watching the performance. At a neural level, they were performing it. This hidden network creates ripples of shared experience that spread through crowds like invisible waves. A single laugh can trigger a cascade of mirror neuron activity that sweeps through an audience. One person's tension can silently infect an entire room. These cells don't just observe, they create a kind of neural Wi-Fi that connects human consciousness in ways we're only beginning to understand. The mystery of mirror neurons deepens when we examine their role in human development. Watch a newborn baby in a hospital nursery. When one infant cries, others soon join in. Their mirror neuron systems are already active, creating webs of shared experience before they've even learned to focus their eyes. It's as if we're born ready to connect, our brains pre-wired for empathy. These neural mirrors work with uncanny precision. In a dance studio in Paris, researchers discovered that a professional ballet dancer's mirror neurons could distinguish between subtle variations in technique that untrained observers missed completely. The neurons weren't just copying movement, they were making sophisticated judgments about skill and form. The phenomenon becomes even more fascinating in group settings. During a tribal drumming ceremony in West Africa, participants' brain scans showed mirror neuron activity, synchronizing not just with the drummers, but with the entire group's collective rhythm. Individual consciousness seemed to merge into a shared neural experience. What makes mirror neurons particularly mysterious is their ability to anticipate actions before they happen. Watch a pitcher wind up for a throw, and these cells activate to predict the entire sequence of motion. They don't just react, they forecast, creating a constant stream of social predictions that helps us navigate human interaction. The system shows remarkable specificity. Mirror neurons in musicians fire differently when hearing mistakes in familiar versus unfamiliar pieces. They seem to know not just what is happening, but what should happen, creating a neural grammar of expected human behavior. Some of the most compelling evidence for mirror neuron mysteries comes from studies of emotion. When someone witnesses another person experiencing disgust, their mirror neurons activate the same brain regions involved in experiencing disgust firsthand. The boundary between observed and felt experience becomes remarkably thin. The phenomenon extends beyond physical actions into abstract thought. While watching someone solve a math problem, mirror neurons fire in patterns suggesting they're working through the solution themselves. These cells seem to create a kind of mental synchrony that allows us to share not just actions, but thought processes. Their role in language adds another layer of mystery. When we hear someone describe an action, our mirror neurons fire as if we're performing it. Read the phrase, "She grasped the rough rope," and your brain activates patterns associated with feeling texture. Language becomes a direct bridge between minds. The system shows fascinating cultural variations. Mirror neurons respond more strongly to gestures from one's own culture, suggesting they learn social meaning over time. Yet they also help us understand unfamiliar customs, creating bridges across cultural divides. Their involvement in art appreciation reveals something profound about human consciousness. Standing before a painting, an observer's mirror neurons activate in patterns matching the artist's brushstrokes. We don't just see art. At a neural level, we recreate the act of its creation. The mystery deepens when examining their role in memory. Recalling a shared experience activates mirror neuron patterns similar to those present during the original event. It's as if these cells don't just create shared experiences, but help encode them into collective memory. The phenomenon becomes particularly intriguing in cases of phantom limb pain. Amputees watching others touch their intact limbs often feel sensation in their missing ones. Mirror neurons seem to maintain a body map that exists independently of physical reality. Their connection to intuition raises fascinating questions. How do we instantly know when someone is angry or sad? Mirror neurons create rapid, unconscious simulations of others' emotional states, allowing us to feel what they feel before conscious thought kicks in. The system's role in skill learning challenges traditional education models. Watch an expert performer, and your mirror neurons create neural patterns that could help you replicate their actions. These cells seem to provide a direct, experiential form of learning that bypasses conscious instruction. Perhaps most mysteriously, mirror neurons appear to operate across species. Primates show mirror neuron activation when watching humans perform actions, and vice versa. These cells seem to create bridges of understanding that transcend evolutionary boundaries. Their involvement in empathy disorders raises intriguing questions. People with autism often show altered mirror neuron activity, suggesting these cells play a crucial role in our ability to understand and connect with others. Yet some autistic individuals develop alternative paths to empathy, revealing the brain's remarkable adaptability. The phenomenon takes on new significance in the digital age. Mirror neurons activate while watching actions on screens, but not as strongly as with live interaction. What does this tell us about virtual connection versus physical presence? Studies of crowd behavior reveal another facet of their mystery. In large groups, mirror neuron activity can synchronize across multiple individuals, creating waves of shared emotion that move through crowds like invisible currents. Individual consciousness seems to merge into a collective experience. The system shows remarkable specificity in social contexts. Mirror neurons respond differently to actions performed by friends versus strangers, suggesting they help create and maintain social bonds. They seem to encode not just what we observe, but who we observe it from. Their role in artistic performance adds another layer of mystery. Musicians playing together show synchronized mirror neuron activity that precedes their coordinated actions. These cells appear to create a kind of neural choreography that allows for precise coordination without conscious planning. The phenomenon becomes particularly fascinating in parent-child relationships. Infants' mirror neurons activate in response to their parents' emotions before they develop conscious awareness of facial expressions. These cells seem to create emotional bonds that precede cognitive understanding. Their involvement in healing raises intriguing possibilities. Watching someone perform physical therapy exercises activates mirror neurons in patterns that could aid recovery. These cells might offer new approaches to rehabilitation and treatment. The system's role in social contagion reveals its power. Yawning, laughter, and even emotional states can spread through groups via mirror neuron networks, creating ripples of shared experience that transcend individual consciousness. Perhaps most profoundly, mirror neurons challenge our notion of individual consciousness. If our brains automatically simulate others' experiences, where does one mind end and another begin? These cells suggest consciousness might be more collective than we imagine. The mystery of mirror neurons reminds us that human connection operates at levels far deeper than conscious thought. Every smile, every gesture, every shared moment activates these neural mirrors, creating webs of shared experience that bind us together in ways we're only beginning to understand. The next time you feel inexplicably moved by someone's joy or pain, remember, your mirror neurons are creating a direct bridge between their experience and yours. In these mysterious cells, we glimpse the neural basis of human connection, the biological foundation of empathy, and perhaps the key to understanding consciousness itself. Cryptomnesia. An acclaimed novelist sits at her desk, proud of the story she's just written. The plot feels fresh, the characters original, the dialogue sharp. 6 months later, she discovers an old book in her childhood collection. It contains the exact story she thought she'd created. This isn't plagiarism. This is cryptomnesia, where forgotten memories resurface disguised as original thoughts. In a prestigious London art gallery, a young painter unveiled what he believed was his masterpiece, an entirely new style of abstract expression. During the opening, an elderly visitor recognized it as identical to an obscure painting from the 1940s Prague. The artist had seen it once, briefly, in a book when he was 7 years old. His mind had stored and then reimagined that image, presenting it decades later as a new creation. The human brain can hide memories for years, even decades, only to return them transformed. A musician crafts what she believes is an original melody, only to realize it's a forgotten lullaby from her childhood. A scientist develops a groundbreaking theory, unaware he'd read it in a paper 20 years ago and buried it in his subconscious. The most striking cases often emerge in the creative fields. A poet in Dublin composed what he thought was a revolutionary new form of verse. The structure felt completely original, born from pure inspiration. Years later, he found his college notebooks containing the exact same poetic form, which he'd studied briefly in a single afternoon class and completely forgotten. The phenomenon becomes even more fascinating when examining its selective nature. A composer might unconsciously reproduce a melody, but create entirely original harmonies around it. A writer might resurrect a forgotten plot while populating it with new characters. It's as if the mind plays mix and match with buried memories, creating collages it presents as original works. The impact on the creative process can be profound. A sculptor in Florence created a series of works she believed were inspired by dreams. Later discoveries revealed each piece closely matched artifacts from an ancient civilization, artifacts she'd seen once in a museum as a child. Her mind had preserved these forms for decades, waiting to present them as inspiration. Sometimes the memories cross cultural and linguistic boundaries. A Japanese author wrote what he believed was an original story, only to discover he had unconsciously recreated an old Welsh folk tale he'd heard once in translation. His mind had stripped away the cultural context, but preserved the narrative structure, presenting it as a new creation years later. The condition raises deep questions about the nature of creativity itself. If our most original ideas might be forgotten memories in disguise, what does this tell us about human imagination? A fashion designer discovered her breakthrough collection unconsciously mimicked patterns from her grandmother's quilts, seen only once in childhood. The phenomenon affects different creative fields in unique ways. Visual artists often reproduce exact images, but in new mediums. Musicians might recreate rhythms, but with different instruments. Writers frequently resurrect plot structures while changing every other story element. The mind seems to hide and transform memories according to each creative discipline's rules. Modern technology has revealed fascinating patterns in how these buried memories resurface. A digital artist created what he thought was an innovative animation style. Video analysis showed it precisely matched the movement patterns of a cartoon he'd watched repeatedly as a child, though the visual elements were completely different. The timing of memory resurrection follows mysterious patterns. Stress, deadlines, and creative pressure often trigger cryptomnesia episodes. A theater director, under intense opening night pressure, suddenly created an innovative staging technique, actually a forgotten scene from an obscure play he'd seen decades earlier. The phenomenon becomes particularly intriguing in collaborative settings. A group of game designers worked on what they believed was a revolutionary new game mechanic. They later discovered they had collectively reconstructed the rules of an ancient board game, which only one team member had briefly encountered years before. Some cases suggest a deeper connection to collective memory. An architect designed what she thought was a unique building structure, only to learn it matched the ruins of an ancient temple she'd never seen. Had she accessed some deeper reservoir of human architectural knowledge? The condition challenges our understanding of originality. A dance choreographer created what felt like entirely new movements, then found footage of herself as a child watching a street performer make those exact gestures. Her mind had stored and transformed these movements across decades. The digital age has added new dimensions to cryptomnesia. Programmers sometimes write code that exactly matches solutions they encountered years ago and forgot. Web designers unconsciously recreate layouts they briefly saw during their early internet experiences. The mind appears to store digital patterns, just as it does organic ones. The phenomenon affects problem solving in unexpected ways. An engineer solved a complex technical challenge with what seemed like a brilliant new approach. Later research revealed it was identical to a solution published in an obscure journal he'd skimmed during his student years. His mind had preserved the solution while forgetting its source. Some cases suggest the condition can work across multiple senses. A chef created what she believed was an innovative flavor combination, only to realize it matched a dish she'd tasted once, decades ago, in a small village restaurant. Her brain had stored not just the taste, but the exact proportions of ingredients. The phenomenon raises profound questions about learning and memory. If our minds can store such detailed information without our awareness, what else might be hidden in our mental archives? A craftsman discovered his innovative woodworking technique exactly matched methods used in medieval workshops, seen once in a documentary, and apparently stored perfectly in his subconscious. The impact on creative confidence can be devastating. Some artists become paralyzed with doubt, questioning whether any of their ideas are truly original. Others develop elaborate systems to cross-reference their inspirations against existing works. The fear of unconscious copying creates its own creative barriers. Yet some have learned to embrace the phenomenon. A novelist deliberately exposes herself to obscure works, trusting her mind to transform and recombine these influences in unique ways. A composer views his brain as a vast library of forgotten melodies, waiting to be rediscovered and reimagined. The condition reveals something profound about human creativity. Perhaps true originality lies not in creating something entirely new, but in how we transform and recombine existing elements. A photographer discovered his most original works were actually reinterpretations of images seen in dreams, themselves likely reconstructions of forgotten visual memories. Modern research has revealed fascinating patterns in how the mind stores and transforms these memories. Some people seem more prone to creative cryptomnesia than others. Their brains appear better at both storing detailed memories and disguising them as original thoughts when they resurface. The phenomenon suggests creativity might be more about transformation than pure invention. A painter realized his distinctive style came from unconsciously combining techniques seen in his youth. Each influence had been forgotten individually, but survived in the unique way he blended them. The digital age has made tracking these memory resurrections easier, but also more complex. Social media constantly exposes us to creative works we quickly forget consciously, but might unconsciously store. The line between inspiration and cryptomnesia becomes increasingly blurred. These cases force us to reconsider what we mean by originality. If every creative act might contain forgotten influences, perhaps genius lies not in being purely original, but in how we transform and recombine our experiences into something that feels new. The next time you have a brilliant creative insight, consider its possible origins. That revolutionary idea might be a forgotten memory in disguise, transformed by your mind into something that feels original. In Cryptomnesia, we glimpse both the limitations and the remarkable power of human creativity, our ability to store, transform, and resurrect experiences in ways that continuously reshape our understanding of originality itself. Foreign accent syndrome. One ordinary morning in Cornwall, England, Jeff Burton woke up to make his usual cup of tea. When he called out "good morning" to his wife, both of them froze. The proud Englishman, who had never left his small coastal town, was speaking with a perfect Russian accent. The doctors were baffled. Jeff had never heard Russian spoken, had no exposure to the language, and had suffered no apparent injury. Yet his thoroughly British voice had vanished overnight. Welcome to one of neurology's most perplexing mysteries, foreign accent syndrome. Imagine waking up to find your voice transformed, speaking your native language with an accent from a country you've never visited. Your words are the same, your thoughts unchanged, but your voice belongs to a stranger. The thing about foreign accent syndrome that baffles medical science isn't just the accent change. It's the uncanny accuracy of accents the patients have never heard. A grandmother in Arizona suddenly speaking with a perfect medieval French accent. A Tokyo sushi chef whose Japanese took on flawless Korean intonations. These aren't rough approximations or crude mimicry. They're linguistically precise accents that should be impossible for the speakers to produce. The story of Margaretha Vandenberg captures the surreal nature of this condition perfectly. A third-generation Dutch farmer from rural Minnesota, she went to bed one night with her usual Midwestern accent. After a mild headache, she woke up speaking English with an impeccable British aristocratic accent. It was like the Queen herself had taken up residence in my mouth, she recalls. My children thought I was playing a joke. But 11 years later, I still sound like I just stepped out of Buckingham Palace. The mysteries only deepen when you look at cases like Antonio Romano, a Sicilian vineyard owner who had never traveled beyond his small village. After a minor fall, his Italian took on the distinct tones of a Johannesburg accent. Not just any South African accent. Linguists who studied his speech patterns identified it as specifically from the wealthy northern suburbs of Johannesburg, an accent he couldn't possibly have learned naturally. What makes these cases particularly fascinating is how the accent changes can reflect historical periods the patients have never experienced. Consider the peculiar case of Olivia Thorne, a modern London businesswoman who suddenly began speaking with the precise accent of Victorian-era British nobility. Language experts confirmed her speech patterns matched those found in recordings from the 1800s. She had essentially developed an authentic historical accent from a time before audio recording even existed. The human cost of this condition goes beyond mere pronunciation. For Winston Mbeki, a prominent South African radio host, the sudden emergence of a heavy Russian accent ended his broadcasting career. Imagine building your life around your voice, he explains, only to have it replaced by something entirely foreign. My listeners thought it was a prank. How do you explain that your voice has been hijacked by another culture? But perhaps the most intriguing cases are those where the accent shifts multiple times. Audrey McPherson, a librarian from Edinburgh, experienced what neurologists call accent migration. Over 6 months, her Scottish brogue transformed into a German accent, then Hungarian, then finally settled into an Australian drawl. Each accent was linguistically perfect, despite Audrey having never visited any of these countries. The condition challenges everything we think we know about how accents are formed. Traditional understanding suggests that accents develop through exposure and practice. Yet people with foreign accent syndrome produce pitch-perfect accents without any learning process. It's as if their brains tap into some universal language blueprint that shouldn't exist. Take the case of Hiroshi Yamamoto, whose story flips the usual pattern on its head. A Japanese monk living in complete isolation for 20 years, he emerged from a meditation retreat speaking his native Japanese with a perfect Texan drawl. Not just any American accent, specifically the distinct dialect of Central Texas, complete with regional idioms he couldn't possibly have learned in his monastery. The timing of these transformations adds another layer of mystery. Unlike most neurological conditions that develop gradually, foreign accent syndrome often appears overnight. Isabella Romano went to sleep after a minor dental procedure, speaking with her natural Neapolitan Italian accent. She awoke sounding precisely like someone from Quebec, not just French-Canadian, but specifically the unique accent of Montreal's East End. The psychological impact can be profound. Imagine looking in the mirror and seeing your familiar face, but when you speak, a stranger's voice emerges. Marcus Blackwood, a Welsh coal miner, developed an upper-class Indian accent after a minor concussion. The voice didn't match my face, my history, or my identity, he recalls. It was like being trapped in someone else's speech patterns. Sometimes the accent changes seem to carry echoes of forgotten history. Consider the case of Rebecca Longfellow, a Native American woman from Oklahoma, who suddenly began speaking with a perfect 18th century British accent. Genealogical research later revealed her great-great-grandmother had been a British settler, though this couldn't explain how Rebecca could replicate an accent from 2 centuries ago. The condition has forced linguistic experts to question fundamental assumptions about language. How can the brain produce such precise accents without any learning process? Where is this linguistic information stored? Some researchers suggest these cases hint at a deeper mystery, that perhaps all human speech patterns are somehow encoded in our neural architecture, waiting to be unlocked by some strange quirk of brain chemistry. Technology has added new dimensions to studying the phenomenon. Advanced imaging shows subtle changes in speech-related brain regions, but nothing that explains the precision of the accent transformations. It's as if the brain's language center gets rerouted through some hidden linguistic database that shouldn't exist. The social implications can be unexpected. Vincent O'Malley, an Irish priest, found his congregation growing after he developed the Italian accent following a minor stroke. "People said I sounded more papal," he jokes, "though it's strange giving sermons in Dublin while sounding like I'm from Rome." Some cases suggest an almost supernatural precision. Magdalena Kowalski, a Polish shopkeeper, developed not just a Japanese accent, but specifically the dialect of Kyoto's Geisha district, circa 1850. Linguistic historians confirmed the accuracy of speech patterns that had largely disappeared from modern use. The condition can even impact artificial forms of communication. Theodore Laurent, a French software engineer, found that his typing patterns changed to match his new Russian accent. His written words began following Russian grammatical structures, despite him having no knowledge of the language. Modern cases have shown the syndrome adapting to contemporary communication. A British teenager developed an accent that seemed to blend Korean pop star speech patterns with California Valley Girl inflections, a modern hybrid that linguists hadn't even properly categorized yet. Recovery remains as mysterious as onset. Some people's original accents return as suddenly as they disappeared. Others develop yet new accents. A few, like Jeff Burton from our opening story, find their voices settling into a hybrid that doesn't quite match any known accent on Earth. What makes these cases so compelling isn't just their strangeness, it's what they reveal about the fragility of identity. Our voices carry our histories, our cultures, our very selves. When that voice changes, It challenges our understanding of who we are. The phenomenon raises profound questions about the nature of human speech and consciousness. If perfect accents can emerge without learning, what does this tell us about the brain's hidden capabilities? Are all possible human speech patterns somehow encoded in our neural architecture, waiting to be unlocked? As research continues, each case adds new layers to the mystery. People developing accents from countries that no longer exist. Children producing speech patterns from historical eras. Accent changes that seem to predict languages they'll encounter in the future. Perhaps most remarkably, many who live with the condition eventually find a strange peace with their new voices. As Margaretha Vandenberg reflects, "At first, I thought I'd lost my voice. Now I realize I've gained a new way of being heard. Maybe we all have multiple voices inside us, waiting to be discovered." The next time you speak, pause to consider the miracle of your own accent. The countless subtle inflections that make your voice uniquely yours. And remember that somewhere in your brain might lie dormant voices you've never heard. Accents from places you've never been, waiting for some strange neural misfire to bring them to life. Mind's eye blindness. Close your eyes and picture a sunset. Imagine a beach with waves gently rolling onto the shore, palm trees swaying in the breeze. Most people can conjure these mental images effortlessly, creating a visual theater in their mind. But for roughly 2% of the population, this simple act is impossible. Their mind's eye is completely blind. Welcome to the mysterious world of aphantasia, a condition where the ability to create mental images simply doesn't exist. No visualizing memories, no picturing loved ones' faces, no counting sheep to fall asleep. For people with aphantasia, thinking happens entirely in concepts, words, and feelings, without any mental pictures at all. Dr. Xavier Thompson, a renowned architect in London, discovered his condition in 2019 during a routine client meeting. "I was asked to close my eyes and envision the building we were designing. Everyone else was discussing the mental changes they were making to the blueprint. I thought they were speaking metaphorically. Until that moment, I had no idea that other people could actually see things in their mind." What makes this condition particularly fascinating isn't just what these individuals can't do. It's how they've adapted to navigate a world built for visual thinkers. Some of history's most creative minds, including Walt Disney animator Glenn Keane, have aphantasia. Yet somehow, they've found ways to create vivid visual art without being able to picture it first in their minds. Dr. Isabella Moretti, a neuroscientist at the University of Milan's Consciousness Research Center, explains, "Aphantasia challenges everything we thought we knew about mental imagery. These individuals have completely different neural pathways for creativity, memory, and planning. Yet they function at the same level as visual thinkers. It's forcing us to reconsider how the human mind works." The condition exists on a spectrum, with varying degrees of image-forming inability. Dr. Helena Kovacic at the Zagreb Institute for Brain Research has identified 3 distinct manifestations. Total aphantasia, complete inability to form any mental images whatsoever. Marina Volkov, a Russian chess grandmaster, exemplifies this variant. "I play chess at the highest level without ever seeing the board in my mind," she explains. "I think in moves and positions as abstract concepts, like a mathematical equation." Selective aphantasia, where certain types of mental imagery are impossible while others remain intact. Professor Aidan O'Connor at Trinity College Dublin can visualize objects, but not faces. "I know my wife has green eyes and brown hair, but I can't picture her face. It's like having a detailed catalog of features without the ability to assemble them." Fluctuating aphantasia, where the ability to form mental images varies over time. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid documents the case of Benjamin Wright, a novelist who lost and regained his ability to visualize after a minor head injury. "The experience transformed his writing style completely," she notes. "His descriptions became more conceptual, focusing on emotions and sensations rather than visual details. The impact on daily life can be profound yet surprisingly subtle. Clara Chen, a master perfumer in Singapore, creates complex fragrances without being able to visualize them. I experience scents as patterns and emotions, not as mental images. Perhaps this is why my perfumes are considered unique. They're composed through a different kind of sensory imagination. The condition raises fascinating questions about memory and dreaming. Dr. Marcus Blackwood at Oxford's Sleep Research Institute has found that people with aphantasia experience dreams differently. Some report having no visual dreams at all, while others can see images only while dreaming, losing this ability upon waking. It suggests that multiple neural pathways exist for generating mental imagery. The advantages of aphantasia have begun to emerge through research. Dr. Elena Santos at the University of São Paulo discovered that people with the condition often excel in abstract thinking and show superior performance in certain problem-solving tasks. Without the distraction of mental images, their thinking can be more focused and analytical, she explains. Perhaps most intriguing are the cases involving identical twins, where only one has aphantasia. The Blackwood sisters, Olivia and Emma, provide a unique window into the condition. When we remember our childhood, Olivia explains, I see vivid images while Emma processes everything as facts and feelings. Yet somehow, we both remember the same details, just in completely different ways. The condition becomes particularly fascinating in creative professionals. Theodore Laurent, a French film director, creates visually stunning movies, despite being unable to visualize them beforehand. I direct through emotion and movement, he explains. Perhaps not seeing the scenes in my head allows me to be more present in the actual moment of creation. Modern research has revealed surprising patterns in how aphantasics process information. Dr. Yuki Tanaka at Kyoto University's Cognitive Science Department found that they often develop enhanced memory systems based on non-visual associations. They create intricate networks of facts, emotions, and concepts that can be just as detailed as visual memories, she notes. The impact on emotional processing adds another layer of complexity. Dr. James Chen at Stanford's Emotion Lab has found that people with aphantasia often process emotional memories differently. Without the ability to replay visual scenes, they focus more on the physical sensations and abstract feelings associated with experiences. Some report more intense emotional memories as a result. The condition has forced educators to rethink teaching methods. Professor Maria Gonzalez at the Barcelona Institute of Learning describes adapting mathematics instruction for aphantasic students. Traditional methods rely heavily on visual imagination. We've developed alternative approaches using tactile and conceptual learning, which sometimes prove superior for all students. The relationship between aphantasia and other cognitive abilities presents fascinating patterns. Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt at the Vienna Cognitive Research Center has documented cases where the condition correlates with exceptional abilities in other areas. We've seen enhanced auditory memory, superior spatial reasoning, and accelerated abstract problem-solving in many cases, he reports. Technology has begun adapting to accommodate different types of mental processing. Dr. Raj Patel at the Mumbai Institute of Technology has developed software that helps aphantasic architects work differently. Instead of requiring mental visualization, the program allows them to manipulate abstract representations in real time, playing to their strengths in conceptual thinking. The condition raises profound questions about consciousness and imagination. Dr. Adelaide Morrison at the Sydney Consciousness Institute suggests, if people can think without mental images, what other aspects of consciousness that we take for granted might be optional? Aphantasia shows us that the human mind is far more diverse than we imagined. Research into aphantasia has revealed surprising insights into creative process. Amara Okonjo, a Nigerian sculptor with the condition, describes her work. I create through touch and spatial awareness, not through mental pre-visualization. Each piece emerges through direct interaction with the material, perhaps making it more authentic than if I had a preconceived image. The social implications can be subtle, but significant. Dr. Thomas Friedrich at Berlin's Social Psychology Department has studied how aphantasics navigate relationships differently. Without the ability to visualize faces, They often develop enhanced sensitivity to voice tones, body language, and emotional nuances. Their social connections may actually be deeper in some ways. The condition has even influenced approaches to artificial intelligence development. Dr. Sarah Blackwood at MIT's AI lab explains, "Studying how aphantasic individuals process information has helped us develop new models of machine learning that don't rely on image-based processing. These systems often prove more efficient for certain types of problems." Recent research has uncovered intriguing patterns in creativity and innovation. The case of Isabella Romano, an Italian fashion designer with aphantasia, stands out. "I design through texture and movement, not through mental images," she explains. "Each piece evolves like a mathematical equation of form and function, perhaps leading to more innovative designs." The condition's impact on memory formation has revealed alternative learning pathways. Dr. Miguel Santos documents the case of a history professor with aphantasia who developed a unique teaching method based on emotional and conceptual connections rather than visual associations. His students consistently outperform others in long-term retention of historical information, Santos notes. As our understanding of aphantasia grows, each discovery leads to new questions. How many different ways can the human mind process information? What role does mental imagery really play in consciousness? And what can this condition teach us about the potential diversity of human cognitive experience? As you contemplate this extraordinary condition, consider how you process your own thoughts and memories. Are your mental images as essential as you believe? Because for some people, the theater of the mind operates without any pictures at all, and their experience reveals just how diverse human consciousness can be. The Impostor Delusion. "My wife came home from work today, but it wasn't her. This woman looks identical. She has my wife's face, her voice, her memories, but she's not my wife. She's an imposter." These words, spoken by renowned physicist Dr. Richard Thorne in 2018, mark one of the most documented cases of Capgras delusion, a condition so bizarre it seems pulled from science fiction. Yet this mysterious disorder, where people become convinced their loved ones have been replaced by identical duplicates, offers a chilling glimpse into how our brains construct reality. At New York Presbyterian Hospital, Dr. Thorne, a quantum physicist whose work on particle entanglement had earned him international recognition, insisted that his wife of 30 years had been replaced by a perfect duplicate. His rational mind could acknowledge the statistical impossibility of his belief. He could even laugh at its absurdity. Yet the conviction remained unshakable. The woman sharing his home was not his wife. "The most terrifying part," notes Dr. Adelaide Morrison, the neuropsychiatrist who documented his case, "wasn't just that he believed in imposters. It was that his brilliant scientific mind began developing complex theories about quantum replication to explain what he was experiencing. The delusion wasn't fighting his intelligence, it was hijacking it." What makes Capgras delusion particularly fascinating is how selective it can be. Patients can recognize every physical detail of their loved one's appearance, remember shared memories, acknowledge identical behaviors, yet remain convinced that the emotional essence, the true identity of their loved one, has been replaced by something else. Dr. Viktor Petrov, a neurologist at the Moscow Brain Research Institute, explains the profound implications. This condition reveals that our recognition of loved ones involves two separate neural pathways, one for facial recognition and another for emotional familiarity. In Capgras patients, the face recognition remains intact, but the emotional connection is severed. They see the face, but don't feel the presence of their loved one. The manifestations of this disorder range from heartbreaking to bizarre. Consider the case of Isabella Romano, a celebrated opera singer in Milan. After a minor car accident, she became convinced that her beloved grand piano had been replaced with an identical copy. "The notes are perfect," she would say during rehearsals, "but the soul of my piano is gone." Despite the instrument being unchanged, she could no longer perform with it. The condition takes different forms across cultures and contexts. Dr. Yuki Tanaka at Tokyo Medical University has documented cases where patients believe entire neighborhoods have been replicated. One patient, a Buddhist monk, became convinced his entire temple had been recreated in another dimension. He could identify every crack in the walls, every worn stone, but insisted the spiritual essence was missing. Modern neuroscience has revealed fascinating insights into the mechanism behind this delusion. Dr. Helena Kovacic at the Zagreb Institute for Brain Research explains, using advanced imaging techniques, we've identified disruptions in the pathways between the visual cortex and the amygdala, the brain's emotional center. The eyes see correctly, but the emotional brain fails to attach significance to what's seen. The variety of cases challenges our understanding of how identity is constructed in the brain. Marcus Blackwood, a London barrister, developed the condition after a mild stroke. He became convinced that his reflection in mirrors had been replaced by an imposter. "I can see it's my face," he reported, "but the person behind the eyes isn't me. He's an excellent copy, but he's not me." Perhaps most intriguing are cases involving multiple replacements. Dr. Fatima al-Rashid at the American University of Beirut describes a patient who believed his wife was replaced by a different imposter each day. He would greet her every morning by asking, "Which one are you today?" He maintained a detailed log of each version, noting subtle differences that existed only in his mind. The impact on families is profound. Maria Gonzalez, whose husband developed Capgras delusion after brain surgery, describes the emotional toll. How do you convince someone you're real? How do you maintain intimacy with a person who believes you're an imposter? Every morning I see hope in his eyes, thinking today might be the day his real wife returns. The condition has forced medical professionals to develop unique treatment approaches. Dr. James Chen at Stanford's Neuropsychiatric Institute pioneered a technique using virtual reality to help patients reconcile their visual and emotional processing. We create virtual environments where patients can safely explore their relationships with duplicates, while we work to rebuild their emotional connections. Some cases have produced unexpected insights into human consciousness. Dr. Amara Okonjo at the Lagos Neuroscience Center documented a case where a philosophy professor developed the delusion regarding his own writings. He could recognize his handwriting, his style, his ideas, but insisted his previous works had been replaced by perfect forgeries. It raised fascinating questions about how we maintain continuity of self across time. The condition becomes even more complex when it involves multiple family members. The case of the Dubois family in Quebec stands out. Identical twins where one developed Capgras delusion. "She could recognize us both as twins," her sister explained, "but believed we had both been replaced by duplicates. Yet she believed her duplicate sister's duplicate was somehow more real than her own duplicate's reflection." Modern research has revealed intriguing patterns in how the delusion manifests across different relationships. Dr. Thomas Friedrich at the Berlin Institute for Cognitive Science notes, "The stronger the emotional bond before the onset, the more likely that person is to be seen as replaced. It's as if the intensity of the missing emotional connection determines who becomes an imposter." The advent of digital technology has added new dimensions to the condition. Dr. Elena Rossi at the University of Bologna describes cases where patients believe their loved ones have been replaced in photographs and videos. One patient developed complex theories about digital manipulation, believing all electronic images of his family had been altered to match the imposters in his life. The condition raises profound questions about the nature of identity and recognition. Dr. Miguel Santos at the University of São Paulo's Consciousness Lab explains, "When we recognize someone we love, we're not just matching visual patterns. We're experiencing a complex emotional response that confirms their identity. Capgras delusion shows us how fragile this process can be." Treatment approaches continue to evolve. Dr. Raj Patel at the Mumbai Neurological Institute has experimented with multisensory integration therapy. We found that focusing on non-visual recognition, voice, touch, smell, can sometimes help rebuild the emotional connections that have been lost. The social implications extend beyond immediate relationships. Xavier Laurent, a French judge, developed the condition regarding his court officers. He could recognize their credentials, their expertise, their history in his court, reports Dr. Marie Dubois, but believed they had all been replaced by highly trained actors. It forced us to examine how we authenticate identity in professional contexts. Recent studies have revealed surprising patterns in dream states. Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt at the Vienna Sleep Research Center found that some Capgras patients recognize their real loved ones in dreams, only to wake up to a world of imposters. It suggests that the emotional recognition system remains intact at some level, accessible only when conscious visual processing is suspended. The condition has even influenced approaches to artificial intelligence development. Dr. Sarah Blackwood at MIT's AI lab explains, "Studying how Capgras patients process identity has helped us understand what makes human recognition different from machine recognition. A computer can match faces perfectly, but can't replicate the emotional component of recognition that, when lost, leads to Capgras." As research continues, each discovery leads to new questions. How does the brain maintain the delusion despite contradictory evidence? Why do some patients develop the condition for certain relationships but not others? What can this tell us about consciousness and identity? Perhaps most poignantly, the condition reveals how our sense of others' identities depends on more than just physical recognition. Dr. Isabella Romano suggests, when we recognize someone we love, we're not just seeing them, we're feeling their presence. Capgras delusion shows us that knowing and feeling are two different things, and both are necessary for true recognition. Remember Dr. Thorne, the physicist? After months of treatment, he began to reconnect emotionally with his replacement wife. "I still know intellectually that she's an imposter," he wrote in his journal, "but I've fallen in love with her just as I loved my original wife. Perhaps that's what matters most." As you consider this extraordinary condition, reflect on how you recognize your own loved ones. Is it their face you recognize, or something deeper, an emotional presence that confirms their identity? Because for some people, that crucial connection has become a bridge to nowhere, leaving them in a world where everyone is familiar, yet no one is truly known. Alien Hand Syndrome. In the quiet halls of Johns Hopkins Hospital, a distinguished neurosurgeon watched in astonishment as his patient's hands engaged in a silent war. The right hand buttoned up a shirt, while the left hand immediately unbuttoned it. The patient, Professor Malcolm Harrison, looked up with a mix of frustration and resignation. "It's not me," he said, pointing to his left hand. "It has its own agenda." This wasn't a case of simple, uncoordinated movement. The left hand wasn't just interfering, it was actively opposing the conscious intentions of its owner. Welcome to the mysterious world of alien hand syndrome, where one hand quite literally develops a mind of its own. Imagine losing control of one of your hands completely, watching it move with purpose and intention, but feeling no connection to its actions. The hand might grasp objects without your permission, throw things you want to keep, or even attempt to strangle you in your sleep. Most disturbing of all, the hand feels foreign, as if it belongs to someone else entirely. Dr. Vianne Dubois, a neurologist at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, describes it as consciousness splitting at the seams. In her 20 years of studying the condition, she's documented cases where patients have had to physically restrain their alien hand with their functional one to prevent it from causing chaos. One of her most fascinating cases involved Gabriel Mercier, a French pianist whose left hand began playing different melodies from his right during concerts. It wasn't just random interference, Dr. Dubois explains. The alien hand would improvise complementary pieces, sometimes better than what he had consciously composed. It was as if there were two musicians sharing one body, neither fully in control. The scientific community recognizes 3 distinct variants of alien hand syndrome, each with its own unique and haunting characteristics. The anarchic hand, most commonly seen after damage to the corpus callosum, the bridge between brain hemispheres. Dr. Rajesh Patel of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders describes a case where a university professor's left hand would repeatedly slap him during lectures. The hand wasn't just moving randomly, Dr. Patel explains. It showed clear intent, waiting for moments when he was most focused on teaching to interfere. The diagonistic dyspraxia variant, where the hands engage in literal combat with each other. Elizabeth Winters, a British architect, found her hands fighting over her morning coffee. One hand would lift the cup while the other attempted to knock it away. It was like watching two people argue, she reported. Except both people were me. The sensory variant, perhaps the most psychologically disturbing form. Patients lose all sense of ownership over the limb while retaining full sensation. Consider the case of Dr. Thomas Friedrich, a German psychiatrist who developed this variant. I feel everything the hand feels, he documented. But the hand doing the feeling isn't mine. It's like being permanently handcuffed to someone else's arm. Modern neuroscience has revealed fascinating insights into how this condition develops. Dr. Helena Kovacic at the Zagreb Institute for Brain Research explains, our sense of bodily ownership, which we take for granted, is actually a complex construction created by multiple brain regions working in harmony. When this network is disrupted, the illusion of unified control breaks down. Using advanced imaging techniques, researchers have identified specific brain areas involved in this breakdown. The supplementary motor area, crucial for planned movement, becomes disconnected from the primary motor cortex, which executes movements. This creates a situation where the hand can act without conscious control while retaining access to complex motor skills. The implications for our understanding of consciousness are profound. Dr. Marcus Wong at the Singapore Neuroscience Institute poses a provocative question. If part of your body can act intelligently without your conscious control, what does this tell us about the nature of consciousness itself? Are we really as unified as we think we are? The daily challenges faced by patients with alien hand syndrome border on the surreal. James O'Connor, a Dublin-based writer, described how his alien hand would delete paragraphs as he typed them with his functioning hand. It became a race, he recalled. I'd write as quickly as possible with my right hand, while my left hand hunted for the delete key. I eventually had to tie it down to finish my novel. The condition has forced medical professionals to develop creative treatment strategies. Dr. Isabella Romano at the Milan Center for Neurological Disorders pioneered a technique using mirror therapy and biofeedback. We teach patients to negotiate with their alien hand rather than fight it, she explains. It's like diplomatic relations between two sovereign entities sharing one body. Some cases have produced circumstances that would be comical if they weren't so distressing. During a conference in Stockholm, neurologist Dr. Astrid Lindgren presented footage of a patient whose alien hand would repeatedly place objects in her purse while shopping, essentially shoplifting against her will. The legal implications were fascinating. Dr. Lindgren notes, how do you assign responsibility when one body contains two apparently distinct agencies? The relationship between patients and their alien hands often evolves in unexpected ways. Maria Fernandez, a Spanish painter, initially fought against her alien hand's interventions in her work. Then I noticed something strange, she reported. The hand was adding elements to my paintings that I hadn't consciously considered, but that improved the composition. I began to think of it as an unconscious collaborator.
The condition raises profound questions about free will and agency. Dr. Fatima Al-Hariri at the Kuwait Neurological Institute has documented cases where the alien hand appears to act on subconscious desires the patient is unwilling to acknowledge. In one case, a patient's hand would repeatedly reach for cigarettes, despite their conscious commitment to quitting. It was as if the hand was expressing suppressed urges.
Cultural differences in how patients interpret and cope with the syndrome provide fascinating insights. Dr. Yuki Nakamura at Tokyo Medical University observed that Japanese patients often anthropomorphize their alien hands, giving them names and distinct personalities. This cultural acceptance of multiple spirits inhabiting one body seems to help some patients cope better with the condition, she notes. The advent of modern technology has created new challenges for patients. Dr. Benjamin Cohen at MIT's Brain-Computer Interface Lab describes a case where a patient's alien hand would constantly try to send emails and make social media posts. We had to develop special software that required biometric confirmation from both hands before sending messages, he explains. Recent research has revealed intriguing patterns in how alien hands behave during sleep. Dr. Elena Popov at the Moscow Sleep Research Institute conducted pioneering studies using night vision cameras. The alien hands often remain active during sleep, performing complex tasks their owners have no memory of. One patient's hand would solve Rubik's cubes in the dark. The condition has even forced philosophers to reconsider fundamental questions about personal identity. Professor Xavier Dumont at the Sorbonne poses the question, if my hand can act intelligently without my conscious control, is it really my hand? Where do we draw the line between self and other? Treatment approaches continue to evolve. Dr. Amara Okonjo at the Lagos Neurological Institute has experimented with virtual reality therapy, creating environments where patients can safely explore the relationship with their alien hand. We've found that acceptance often works better than resistance, she explains. The more patients fight against the hand, the more it seems to resist. The future of research into alien hand syndrome points in fascinating directions. Some scientists are studying the condition for insights into developing more intuitive prosthetic limbs. Others see it as a window into the nature of consciousness itself. Dr. James Chen at Stanford's Consciousness Lab suggests, these cases show us that conscious will and intelligent action can be separated. This has profound implications for our understanding of free will. The social impact on patients and their families creates unique challenges. Support groups have formed where people share strategies for daily living with an autonomous limb. Patricia Rodriguez, who runs such a group in Barcelona, shares, we teach practical skills like how to eat soup when one hand is trying to spill it, but more importantly, we help people accept. The reality glitch. Have you ever learned a new word, then suddenly started seeing it everywhere? Or bought a car and noticed the same model appearing on every street? This isn't coincidence. You've stumbled into one of the mind's most peculiar glitches, the frequency illusion, where reality seems to get stuck repeating patterns that weren't there before. In 1994, a newspaper editor noticed something odd after buying his first Volkswagen Beetle. Not only did he start seeing Beetles everywhere, but specifically red ones, exactly like his. He began keeping count, 3 on his way to work, 5 at the supermarket, 4 during lunch. The cars had always been there, but his mind had suddenly decided to spotlight them, creating an artificial pattern in his reality. This wasn't just selective attention. His brain had rewired itself around the concept of red beetles, creating a filter that highlighted them against the background noise of daily life. Other cars faded into a blur, but every red beetle blazed like a signal fire in his consciousness. The phenomenon goes far deeper than cars and words. Artists report seeing their chosen color palette appearing in nature. Musicians hear their composition's rhythm in city sounds. Architects find their designs reflected in random arrangements of clouds. It's as if the mind, once it grasps a pattern, projects it everywhere, even where it doesn't exist. But what makes this phenomenon truly fascinating is how it can reshape entire worldviews. A clockmaker in Geneva found himself seeing clock face patterns in everything: the arrangement of birds on telephone wires, the way leaves fell on water, the distribution of stars in the night sky. His mind had become so attuned to circular patterns that the entire universe began arranging itself into timepieces. The illusion doesn't just affect visual patterns. After losing her mother, a woman in Portland began hearing her mother's favorite phrase in random conversations. The words hadn't become more common. Her grief-attuned brain was plucking them from the stream of daily speech, creating phantom echoes of loss. Sometimes the phenomenon creates its own self-fulfilling prophecies. A coffee shop owner became convinced that customers wearing red brought bad luck. Soon she was noticing every red-clothed customer, documenting their impact on her day. The more she looked for the pattern, the more evidence she found, her mind selectively filtering reality to support her belief. The mind's pattern recognition machinery can create startlingly specific filters. A rare book collector began noticing misprinted page numbers everywhere, in magazines, newspapers, even street addresses. His specialty had trained his brain to spot numerical irregularities, and now they seemed to multiply in his world like a mathematical virus. The phenomenon becomes particularly intriguing in creative fields. A novelist writing about lighthouses suddenly saw lighthouse imagery everywhere, in corporate logos, architectural details, even the way sunlight fell through Venetian blinds. Her brain had created a lighthouse-shaped lens through which to view reality. What makes these cases so compelling is their demonstration of how malleable our perception really is. A botanist studying a rare flower pattern found similar arrangements appearing in wallpaper designs, fabric prints, even graffiti. The pattern hadn't become more common. Her consciousness had simply developed a new filter for reality. The illusion can even affect temporal perception. After learning about a specific historical date, people often report encountering that same number sequence repeatedly, on clocks, receipts, license plates. Time itself seems to conspire to reinforce the pattern, though it's really the mind selectively highlighting matches from the constant stream of numbers we encounter. Some cases suggest the phenomenon can spread between people. A group of art students all began noticing the same obscure shade of blue after their professor mentioned it in class. Soon, they were sending each other photos of this specific color appearing in unexpected places, their collective attention amplifying the illusion. The digital age has given the frequency illusion new territory to explore. Web designers report seeing their user interface patterns reflected in real-world objects. Programmers find their code structures appearing in street layouts. Social media algorithms seem to amplify these patterns, creating digital echo chambers of repeated motifs. The phenomenon raises fascinating questions about the nature of reality itself. If our brains can so easily create these false patterns, what other aspects of our perceived reality might be constructed rather than discovered? A quantum physicist studying wave patterns found herself seeing probability distributions in coffee stains and rain puddles. Sometimes the illusion reveals unexpected connections. A marine biologist studying spiral shell patterns began noticing the same mathematical sequence in galaxy formations. The pattern had always existed in both places, but it took her specialized attention to highlight the connection between sea and stars. The phenomenon can even affect bodily sensations. After learning about a specific pressure point, massage therapists report feeling that same point calling for attention in every client. Their trained touch begins finding the pattern everywhere, though it may not have been significant before their awareness was tuned to it. These cases reveal something profound about consciousness. A meditation teacher noticed that after describing a particular state of mind to his students, they began seeing metaphors for it everywhere. The abstract had become concrete through the lens of their focused attention. The illusion demonstrates the mind's remarkable ability to create meaning from randomness. Birdwatchers don't just see more birds. They see specific species-related patterns in clouds, tree branches, and shadow formations. Their expertise creates a template through which the chaos of reality is filtered and organized. Modern technology has added new layers to the phenomenon. People report seeing their phone's interface layout reflected in building facades, their app icon arrangements appearing in tile patterns. The digital world has begun to overlay our perception of physical reality, creating new templates for pattern recognition. The frequency illusion can even affect memory. After focusing on a particular childhood experience, people often report finding forgotten photos that echo that memory, or hearing stories that seem to reference it. The mind begins curating reality to support its chosen narrative. What makes these cases particularly significant is their implication for understanding consciousness. If our attention can so dramatically filter our experience of reality, what does this tell us about the nature of perception itself? A neuroscientist studying pattern recognition found herself seeing neural networks in tree branches and river systems. The phenomenon suggests that our experience of reality is more participatory than we imagine. An archaeologist focused on a specific pottery pattern began finding similar designs in modern architecture. Her expertise wasn't just helping her recognize patterns, it was actively shaping what she was capable of seeing. Some cases hint at deeper mysteries of consciousness. People report seeing their dream imagery reflected in waking life, or finding their creative projects mysteriously anticipated in random patterns. It's as if the mind's focus can bend probability itself, though it's really just highlighting what it's primed to see. The illusion reveals how our beliefs shape our reality. After learning about sacred geometry, an architect began seeing these patterns everywhere, in leaf arrangements, cloud formations, city layouts. The mathematical principles had always been there, but his newfound awareness made them suddenly visible. Perhaps most intriguingly, the phenomenon shows how personal meaning can override objective reality. A grieving father began seeing his daughter's name everywhere, in license plates, shop signs, random combinations of letters. His loss had created a filter that extracted personal significance from cosmic randomness. The digital age has amplified these effects. Social media users report seeing their chosen hashtags appearing in unlikely places, their online interests manifesting in physical world patterns. The boundary between digital and real-world pattern recognition has become increasingly blurred. The frequency illusion challenges our understanding of coincidence. A musician working with a specific rhythm began hearing it in traffic patterns, bird songs, even her own heartbeat. The pattern hadn't become more common. Her consciousness had simply tuned itself to that particular frequency of reality. These cases suggest something profound about human consciousness. We don't just passively observe reality, we actively create it through our attention and expectations. A photographer focusing on geometric shadows found them multiplying in her world, her artistic vision literally reshaping her perception of reality. The phenomenon reminds us that our experience of the world is always filtered through the lens of our attention. That newspaper editor never went back to seeing red beetles as just another car. Once his mind created that category of significance, it became a permanent feature of his reality. The next time you notice a pattern suddenly appearing everywhere, remember, you're not just observing reality, you're participating in its creation. Your consciousness is selecting, filtering, and highlighting aspects of the infinite patterns that surround us, turning chaos into meaningful design through the remarkable machinery of attention.